The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood, audiobook voiced by Miriam, Wendy, Alexis, Elena, and Daniel.
Chapter 1. A Low Art. Now that I'm dead, I know everything. This is what I wish would happen, but like so many of my wishes, it failed to come true. I know only a few factoids that I didn't know before. Death is too high a price to pay for the satisfaction of curiosity, needless to say. Since being dead, since achieving the state of bonelessness, liplessness, breathlessness, I've learned some things I would rather not know, as one does when listening at windows or opening other people's letters. You think you'd like to read minds? Think again. Down here, everyone arrives with a sack, like the sacks you used to keep the winds in, but each of these sacks is full of words. Words you've spoken, words you've heard, words that have been said about you. Some sacks are small, others large. My own is of reasonable size, though a lot of the words in it concern my imminent husband. What a fool he made of me, some say. It was a specialty of his, making fools. He got away with everything, which was another specialty of his, getting away. He was always so plausible. Many people have believed that his version of events was the true one. Give or take, a few murders, a few beautiful seductressness, a few one-eyed monsters. Even I believed him from time to time. I knew he was tricky and a liar. I just didn't think he would play his tricks and try out his lies on me. Hadn't I been faithful? Hadn't I waited and waited and waited despite the temptation, almost the compulsion to do otherwise? And what did I amount to? Once the official version gained around, a defying legend, a stick used to beat the other women with. Why couldn't they be as considerate, as trustworthy, as all-suffering as I had been? That was the line they took, the singers, the yard spinners. Don't follow my example. I'll want to scream in your ears. Yes, yours. But when I try to scream, I sound like an owl. Of course I had inklings about his slipperousness, his willingness, his foxishness, how can I put this, his unscrupulousness. But I turned a blind eye. I kept my mouth shut, or if I opened it, I sang his praises. I didn't contradict. I didn't ask awkward questions. I didn't dig deep. I wanted happy endings in those days, and happy endings are best achieved by keeping the right doors locked and going to sleep during the rampages. But after the main events were over and things had become less legendary, I realized how many people were laughing at me behind my back, how they were jeering, making jokes about me, jokes both clean and dirty, how they were turning me into a story or into several stories, though not the kind of stories I'd prefer to hear about myself. What can a woman do when scandalous gossip travels the world? If she defends herself, she sounds guilty. So I waited some more. Now that all the others have run out of air, it's my turn to do a little story making. I owe it to myself. I've had to work myself up to it. It's a low art. Tell-telling. Old women go in for it, strolling beggars, blind singers, maid servants, children's, folks with time on their hands. Once people would have laughed if I tried to play the minstrel. There's nothing more preposterous than an astrocat bumbling around with the arts. But who cares about public opinion now? The opinion of the people down here, the opinion of shadows, of echoes. So I'll spin a thread of my own. The difficulty is that I have no mouth through which I can speak. I can't make myself understood. Not in your world, not in the world of bodies, of tongues and fingers. And most of the time I have no listeners, not on your side of the river. Those of you who may catch the odd whisper, the odd squeak, so easily mistake my words for breezes rustling the dry reeds, for bats at twilight, for bad dreams. But I've always been a determined nature. Patient, they used to call me. I like to see a thing through to the end.
Chapter 2. The Chorus Line, a rope-jumping rhyme. We are the maids, the ones you killed, the ones you failed. We danced in air, our bare feet twitched, it was not fair. With every goddess, queen, and bitch, from there to here you scratched your itch. We did much less than what you did, you judged us bad. You had the spirit, you had the word, at your command. We scrubbed the blood of our dead paramours, from floors, from chairs, from stairs, from doors. We knelt in water while you stared. At our bare feet, it was not fair. You licked our fear, it gave you pleasure. You raised your hand, you watched us fall. We danced on air, the ones you failed, the ones you killed.
Chapter 3. My Childhood. Where shall I begin? There are only two choices, at the beginning or not at the beginning. The real beginning would be the beginning of the world, after which one thing has led to another. But since there are differences of opinion about that, I'll begin with my own birth. My father was King Icarus of Sparta, my mother was a naiad. Daughters of naiads were a dime a dozen in those days. The place was crawling with them. Nevertheless, it never hurts to be of semi-divine birth, or it never hurts immediately. When I was quite young my father ordered me to be thrown into the sea. I never knew exactly why during my lifetime, but now I suspect he'd been told by an oracle that I would weave his shroud. Possibly he thought that if he killed me first, his shroud would never be woven, as he would live forever. I can see how the reasoning might have gone. In that case, his wish to drown me came from an understandable desire to protect himself. But he must have misheard, or else the oracle herself misheard. The gods often mumble, because it was not his shroud that was at issue, but my father-in-law's shroud. If that was a prophecy, it was a true one, and indeed the weaving of his particular shroud proved a great inconvenience to me later on in my life. The teaching of crafts to girls fallen out of fallen out of fashion now. I understand, but luckily it had not in my day. It's always an advantage to have something to do with your hands. That way if someone makes an inappropriate remark, you can pretend that you haven't heard it. Then you don't have to answer. Perhaps this shrewd weaving oracle idea of mine is baseless. Perhaps I have only invented it in order to make myself feel better. So much whispering goes on in the dark caverns in the meadows that sometimes it's hard to know whether the whispering is coming from others or from the inside of your own head. I use head figuratively. We have dispensed with heads as such down here. No matter, into the sea I was thrown. Do I remember the waves closing over me? Do I remember the breath leaving my lungs and the sound of bells people say, the drowning here? Not in the least. But I was told the story. There is always some servant or slave or old nurse or busybody ready to regale a child with awful things done to it by its parents when it was too young to remember. Hearing this discouraging anecdote did not improve my relations with my father. It is to this episode, or rather to my knowledge of it, that I attribute my reserve as well as my mistrust of other people's intentions. It was stupid of Icarus to try to drown the daughter of a naiad. However, water is our element. It is our birthright. Although we are not such good swimmers as our mothers, we do have a way of floating, and we're well connected among the fish and seabirds. A flock of purple striped ducks came to my rescue and towed me ashore. After an omen like that, what could my father do? He took me back and renamed me. Duck was my new nickname. No doubt he felt guilty about what he'd almost done. He became, if anything, rather too affectionate towards me. I found this affection difficult to reciprocate. You can imagine, there I would be, strolling hand in hand with my apparently fond male parent along a cliff edge or a river bank or a parapet, and the thought would occur to me that he might suddenly decide to shove me or bash me to death with a rock. During a calm facade under these circumstances was a challenge. After such excursions, I would retire to my room and dissolve in floods of tears. Excessive weeping, I might as well tell you now, is a handicap of the naiad born. I spent at least a quarter of my earthly life crying my eyes out. Fortunately, in my time, there were veils. They were a practical help for disguising red puffy eyes. My mother, like all naiads, was beautiful but chilly at heart. She had waving hair and dimples, and rippling laughter. She was elusive. When I was little, I often tried to throw my arms around her, but she had a habit of sliding away. I like to think that she may have been responsible for calling up that flocks of ducks, but probably she wasn't. She preferred swimming in the river to care of small children, and I often slipped her mind. If my father hadn't had thrown me into the sea, she might have dropped me in herself, in a fit of absent-mindedness of irritation. She had a short attention span and rapidly changing emotions. You can see by what I've told you that I was a child who learned early the virtues, if such they are, or self-sufficiency. I knew that I would have to look out for myself in the world. I could hardly count on family support.
Chapter 4 The Chorus Line Kitty Mourn a Lament by the Maids. We too were children. We too were born into the wrong parents. Poor parents, slave parents, peasant parents, and serf parents. Parents who sold us, parents who from we were stolen from. These parents were not gods, they were not demigods, they were not nymphs or naiads. We were set to work in the palace as children. We drudged from dawn to dusk as children. If we wept, no one dried our tears. If we slept, we were kicked awake. If we were told we were motherless, then we were told that we were fatherless. We were told that we were lazy. We were told that we were dirty. We were dirty. Dirt was our concern. Dirt was our business. Dirt was our specialty. Dirt was our fault. We were the dirty girls. If our owners or sons of our owners or visiting noblemen or the sons of visiting noblemen wanted to sleep with us, we could not refuse. It did us no good to weep. It did us no good to say that we were in pain. All of this happened to us when we were children. If we were pretty children, our lives were worse. We ground the flour for lavish wedding feast, then we ate the leftovers. We would never have a wedding feast of our own. No rich gifts would be exchanged for us. Our bodies had little value, but we wanted to sing and dance too. We wanted to be happy too. As we grew older, we became polished and evasive. We mastered the secret sneer. We swayed our hips, we lurked, we winked, we signaled with our eyebrows, even when we were children. We met boys behind the pig pens, noble boys and ignoble boys. We rolled around in the straw, in the mud, in the dug, on the beds of the soft fleece we were making up for our masters. We drank the wine left in the wine cups. We spat on the serving platters. Between the bright hall and the dark scullery we crammed flinched meat in our mouth. We laughed together in our attics, and in our nights. We snatched what we could.
Chapter 5 Asphodel. It's dark here, as many have remarked. Dark death, they used to say. The gloomy halls of Hades and so forth. Well, yes, it is dark, but there are advantages. For instance, if you see someone you'd rather not speak to, you can always pretend you haven't recognized them. There are, of course, the fields of Asphodel. You can walk around in them if you want. It's brighter there, and a certain amount of vapid dancing goes on. Though the region sounds better than it is. The fields of Asphodel has a poetic lilt to it. But just consider. Asphodel, asphodel, asphodel. Pretty enough, white flowers, but a person gets tired of them after a while. It would have been better to supply some variety, an assortment of colors, a few winding paths and vistas, and stone benches and fountains. I would have preferred the old hacienda at least, and would a sprinkling of crocuses have been too much to expect, though we never get spring here or any other season. You do have to wonder who designed the place. Have I mentioned the fact that there's nothing to eat except asphodel? But I shouldn't complain. The darker growths are more interesting. The conversation there is better. If you can find a minor rascal of some sort, a pickpocket, a stockbroker, a small-time pimp. Like a lot of goody-goody girls, I was always secretly attracted to men of that kind. I don't frequent the really deep levels much, though. That's where the punishments are dealt out, the truly villainous. Those who were never sufficiently punished while alive. It's hard to put up with the screams. The torture is mental torture. However, since we don't have bodies anymore, what the gods really like is to conjure up banquets. Big platters of meat, heaps of bread, bunches of grapes and then snatch them away. Making people roll heavy stones up steep hills is another of their favorite jests. I sometimes have a yen to go down there. It might help me to remember what it was like to have a real hunger, what it was like to have a real fatigue. Every once in a while the fogs part and we get a glimpse of the world of the living. It's like rubbing the glass on a dirty window, making a space to look through. Sometimes the barrier dissolves and we can go out on an outing. Then we get very excited, and there is a great deal of squeaking. These outings can take place in many ways. Once upon a time, anyone who wished to consult us would slit the throat of a sheep or cow or pig, and let the blood flow into a trench in the ground. We'd smell it and make a beeline for the site, like flies to carcass. There would be chirping and fluttering, thousands of us, like the contents of a giant waste paper basket caught in a tornado, while some self-styled hero held us off with drawn sword until the one he wanted to consult appeared. A few vague prophecies would be forthcoming. We learned to keep them vague. Why tell everything? You need to keep them coming back for more, with other sheep, cows, pigs, and so forth. Once the right number of words have been handed over to the hero, we'd all be allowed to drink for the trench. And I can't say much in praise of the table manners on such occasions. There was a lot of pushing and shoving, a lot of slurping, spilling. There were a lot of crimson chins. However, it was glorious to feed the blood coursing in our non-existent veins again, if only for an instant. We could sometimes appear as dreams, though that wasn't as satisfactory. Then there were those who got stuck on the wrong side of the river, because they hadn't been given proper burials. They wandered around in a very unhappy state, neither here nor there, and they could cause a lot of trouble. Then, after hundreds, possibly thousands of years, it's hard to keep track of time here, because we don't have any of it as such. Customs changed. No living people went to the underworld much anymore, and our own Abdul was upstaged by a much more spectacular establishment down the road. Fiery pits, wailing and gnashing of teeth, gnawing worms, demons with pitchforks, a great many special effects. But we were still called up occasionally by magicians and conjurers, men who'd make pacts with the infernal powers, and then by smaller fry, the table tilters, the mediums, the channelers, people of that ilk. It was demeaning, all of it, to have to materialize in a chalk circle or a velvet upholstered parlor just because someone wanted to gape at you. But it did allow us to keep up with what was going on among the still alive. I was very interested in the invention of the light bulb, for instance, and in the matter into energy theories of the 20th century. More recently, some of us have been able to infiltrate the new ethereal wave system that now encircles the globe, and to travel around that way, looking out at the world through the flat, illuminated surfaces that serve as domestic shrines. Perhaps that's how the gods were able to come and go as quickly as they did back then. They must have something like that at their disposal. I never got summoned much by the magicians. I was famous, yes, ask anyone, but for some reason they didn't want to see me, whereas my cousin Helen was much in demand. It didn't seem fair. I wasn't known for doing anything notorious, especially of a sexual nature, and she was nothing if not infamous. Of course, she was very beautiful. It was claimed she'd come out of an egg, being the daughter of Zeus, who'd raped her mother in the form of a swan. She was quite stuck up about it, was Helen. I wondered how many of us really believed the swan rape concoction. There were a lot of stories of that kind going around then. The gods couldn't seem to keep their hands or paws or brakes off mortal women. They were always raping someone or other. Anyway, the magicians insisted on seeing Helen, and she was willing to obey. It was like a return to the old days to have a lot of men gawping at her. She liked to appear in one of those Trojan outfits, over-decorated to my taste. But Shankun, she had a kind of slow twirl she would do. Then she'd lower her head and glance up into the face of whoever had conjured her up, and give one of her trademark intimate smiles, and they were hers. Or she'd take on the form in which she displayed herself to her outraged husband, Menelaus, when Troy was burning, and he was about to plunge his vengeful sword into her. All she had to do was bare one of her peerless breasts, and he was down on his knees, and drooling and begging to take her back. As for me, well, people told me I was beautiful. They had to tell me that because I was a princess, and shortly after that, a queen. But the truth was that although I was not deformed or ugly, I was nothing special to look at. I was smart, though, considering the times, very smart. That seems to be what I was known for, being smart. That, and my weaving, and my devotion to my husband, and my discretion. If you were a magician messing around in the dark arts and risking your soul, would you want to conjure up a plain but smart wife who'd been good at weaving and had never transgressed, instead of a woman who'd driven hundreds of men mad with lust and had caused a great city to go up in flames? Neither would I. Helen was never punished, not one bit. Why not? I'd like to know. Other people got strangled by sea serpents and drowned in storms and turned into spiders and shot with arrows for much smaller crimes. Eating the wrong cows, boasting, that sort of thing. You'd think Helen might have a good whipping at the very least after all the harm and suffering she caused to countless other people, but she didn't. Not that I minded. I had other things in my life to occupy my attention, which brings me to the subject of my marriage.
Chapter 6, My Marriage. My marriage was arranged. That's the way things were done then. Where there were weddings, there were arrangements. I don't mean such things as bridal outfits, flowers, banquets, and music, though we had those too. Everyone has those, even now. The arrangements, I mean, were more devious than that. Under the old rules, only important people had marriages, because only important people had inheritances. All the rest was just copulation of various kinds, rapes or seductions, love affairs or one-night stands with gods who said they were shepherds or shepherds who said they were gods. Occasionally a goddess might get mixed up in it too, dabble around in perishable flesh like a queen playing at milkmaids, but the reward for a man was a shortened life and often a violent death. Immortality and mortality didn't mix well. It was fire and mud, and only the fire always won. The gods were never averse to making a mess. In fact, they enjoyed it. To watch some mortal with his or her eyes frying in their sockets through an overdose of god sex made them shake with laughter. There was something childish about the gods in a nasty way. I can say this now because I no longer have a body. I'm beyond that kind of suffering, and the gods aren't listening anyway. As far as I can tell, they've gone to sleep. In your world, you don't get visitations from the gods the way people used to unless you're on drugs. Where was I? Oh yes, marriages. Marriages were for having children, and children were not toys and pets. Children were vehicles for passing things along. These things could be kingdoms, rich wedding gifts, stories, grudges, blood feuds. Through children, alliances were forged. Through children, wrongs were avenged. To have a child was to set loose a force in the world. If you had an enemy, it was best to kill his sons, even if those sons were babies. Otherwise, they would grow up and hunt you down. If you couldn't bring yourself to slaughter them, you could disguise them and send them far away or sell them as slaves. But as long as you were alive, they would be a danger to you. If you had daughters instead of sons, you needed to get them bred as soon as possible so they could have grandsons. The more sword wielders and spear throwers you could count on from within your family, the better, because all the other noteworthy men around were on the lookout for a pretext to raid some king or noble and carry away anything they could grab, people included. Weakness in one power holder meant opportunity for another, so every king and noble needed all the help he could get. Thus, it went without saying that a marriage would be arranged for me when the time came. At the court of King Icarus, my father, they still retained the ancient custom of having contests to see who should marry a noble-born woman who was, so to speak, on the block. The man who won the contest got the woman and the wedding, and then was expected to stay at the bride's father's palace and contribute to his share of male offspring. He obtained wealth through the marriage: gold cups, silver bowls, horses, robes, weapons, all that trash they used to value so much back when I was alive. His family was expected to hand over a lot of this trash as well. I can say trash because I know where most of it ended up. It molded away in the ground, or it sank to the bottom of the sea, or got broken or melted down. Some of it made its way to enormous palaces that have, strangely, no kings or queens in them. Endless processions of people in graceless clothing file through these palaces, staring at the gold cups and the silver bowls, which are not even used anymore. Then they go to a sort of market inside the palace and buy pictures of these things, or miniature versions of them that are not real silver or gold, and that is why I say trash. Under the ancient customs, the huge pile of sparkling wedding loot stayed with the bride's family in the bride's palace. Perhaps that is why my father had become so attached to me after having failed to drown me in the sea where I was. There would be the treasure. Why did he throw me in? That question still haunts me, although I'm not altogether satisfied with the shroud weaving explanation. I've never been able to find the right answer, even down here. Every time I see my father in the distance, wading through the asphodel and trying to catch up with him, he hurries away as if he doesn't want to face me. I've sometimes thought I may have been a sacrifice to the god of the sea, who is known to be thirsty for human life. Then the ducks rescued me through no act of my father's. I suppose my father could argue that he fulfilled his side of the bargain, if bargain it was, and that he hadn't cheated, and that if the sea god had failed to drag me down and devour me, that it was his own luck. The more I think about this version of events, the more I like it. It makes sense. Picture me, then, as a clever but not overly beautiful girl of marriageable age, let's say 15. Suppose I'm looking at the window of my room, which was on the second floor of the palace, down into the courtyard where the contestants are gathering, all those young hopefuls who wish to compete for my hand. I don't look directly out of the window, of course. I don't plant my elbows on the windowsill like some hulking maid and stare shamelessly. No, I peek. From behind my veil and from behind the drapery. It would not do to let all those scantily clad young men see my unveiled face. The palace women have dolled me up as best they can. Minstrels have composed songs of praise in my honor, radiant as Aphrodite, and all the usual claptrap. But I feel shy and miserable. The young men laugh and joke. They seem at ease with one another. They do not glance up. I know it isn't me they're after, not Penelope the duck. It's only what comes with me, the royal connection, the pile of glittering junk. No man will ever kill himself for the love of me. And no man ever did. Not that I would have wanted those kinds of suicides. I was not a man-eater. I was not a siren. I was not like Cousin Helen, who loved to make conquests just to show she could. As soon as the man was groveling, and it never took long, she'd stroll away without a backwards glance, giving that careless laugh of hers, as if she'd just been watching the palace midget standing ridiculously on his head. I was a kind girl, kinder than Helen, or so I thought. I knew I would have to have something to offer instead of beauty. I was clever. Everyone said so. In fact, they said it so much that I found it discouraging. But cleverness is a quality a man likes to have in his wife, as long as she is some distance away from him. Up close, he'll take kindness any day of the week, if there's nothing more alluring to be had. The most obvious husband for me would have been a younger son of a king with large estates, one king of Nestor boys, perhaps. That would have been a good connection for King Icarus. Through my veil, I studied the young men milling around down below, trying to figure out who each one was, a thing of no practical consequence, since it wasn't up to me to choose my husband, which one I preferred. A couple of the maids were with me. They never left me unattended. I was a risk until I was safely married, because who knew what upstart fortune hunter might try to seduce me or seize me and run away with me. The maids were my sources of information. They were ever-flowing fountains of trivial gossip. They could come and go freely in the palace. They could study the men from all angles. They could listen in on their conversations. They could laugh and joke with them as much as they pleased. No one cared who might worm his way in between their legs. "Who's the barrel-chested one?" I asked. "Oh, that's Odysseus," said one of the maids. He was not considered by the maids, at least, to be a serious candidate for my hand. His father's palace was on Ithaca, a goat-strewn rock. His clothes were rustic. He had the manners of a small-town big shot and had already expressed several complicated ideas that others considered peculiar. He was clever, though, they said. In fact, he was too clever for his own good. The other young man made jokes about him. "Don't gamble with Odysseus, the friend of Hermes," they said. "You'll never win." This was like saying he was a cheat and a thief. His grandfather Autoclus was well known for these very qualities and was reputed never to have won anything fairly in his life. "I wonder how fast he can run," I said. "In some kingdoms, the contest for the brides was a wrestling match, and others a chariot race. But with us, it was just running. Not very fast on those short legs of his," said one of the maid unkindly. And indeed, the legs of Odysseus were quite short in relation to his body. It was all right when he was sitting down. You didn't notice, but standing up, he looked top-heavy. "Not fast enough to catch you," said another of the maids. "You wouldn't want to wake up in the morning and find yourself in bed with your husband and a herd of Apollo cows." That was a joke about Hermes, whose first act was of thievery on the day he was born, involved in Autochius cattle raid. Not unless one of them was a bull, said another, or else a goat, said a third. A big strong ram, said a fourth. Better a ram than the baby fingers you get around here. They all began laughing, holding their hands over their mouths and snorting with mirth. I was mortified. I didn't understand the coarser kind of jokes, not yet, so I didn't know exactly why they were laughing, though I understood that their laughter was at my expense, but I had no way of making them stop. At this moment, my cousin Helen came sailing up like the long-necked swan she fancied herself to be. She had a distinctive swaying walk, and she was exaggerating it. Although mine was the marriage in question, she wanted all the attention for herself. She was as beautiful as usual, indeed more so. She was intolerably beautiful. She was dressed to perfection. Menelaus, her husband, always made sure of that, and he was rich as stinks, so he could afford it. She tilted her face towards me, looking at me whimsically as if she were flirting. I suspect she used to flirt with her dog, with her mirror, with her comb, with her bedpost. She needed to keep in practice. I think Odysseus would make a very suitable husband for our little ducky, she said. She likes the quiet life, and she'll certainly have that if he takes her to Ithaca. As he's boasting of doing, she can help him look after his goats. She and Odysseus are two of a kind. They both have short legs. She said this lightly, but her lightest sayings were often her cruelest. Why is it that really beautiful people think everyone else in the world exists merely for their amusement? The maid snickered. I was crushed. I had not thought my legs were quite that short, and I certainly hadn't thought Helen would notice them, but not as much escaped her when it came to asserting the physical graces and defects of others. That was what got her in trouble with Paris. Later, he was so much better looking than Menelaus, who was lumpish and red-haired. The best that was claimed of Menelaus, once they started putting him into poems, that he had a very loud voice. The maids all looked at me to see what I would say, but Helen had a way of leaving people speechless, and I was no exception. Never mind, little cousin, she said to me, patting me on the arm. They say he's very clever, and you're very clever too, they tell me, so you'll be able to understand what he says. I certainly never could. It was lucky for both of us that he didn't win me. She gave the patronizing smirk of someone who had the first chance at a less than delicious piece of sausage but had fastidiously rejected it. Indeed, Odysseus had been among the suitors for her hand, and like every other man on the earth, he desperately wanted to win her. Now he's competing for what was at best only second prize. Helen strode away, having delivered her sting. The maids began discussing her splendid necklace, her scintillating earrings, her perfect nose, her elegant hairstyle, her luminous eyes, the tastefully woven border of her shining robe. It was as if I wasn't there, and it wasn't my wedding day. All of this was a strain on my nerves. I started to cry, as I would do so often in the future, and was taken to lie down on my bed. Thus I missed the race itself. Odysseus won it. He cheated, as I later learned. My father, brother, Uncle Tertius, father of Helen, though, as I have told you, some said that Zeus was her real father, helped him to do it. He mixed the wine of the other contestants with the drug that slowed them down, though not so much as they would notice. He gave a potion that had the opposite effect. I understood that this sort of thing had become a tradition, and is still practiced in the world of living when it comes to athletic contests. Why did Uncle Tyndareus help my future husband in this way? They were neither friends nor allies. What did Tyndareus stand to gain? My uncle would not have helped anyone, believe me, simply out of the goodness of his heart. A comedy that was in short supply. One story had it that I was a payment for a service Odysseus had rendered to Tyndareus. When they were all competing for Helen and things were getting more and more angry, Odysseus made each contestant swear an oath that whoever won Helen must be defended by all the others if any other man tried to take her away from the winner. In that way, he calmed things down and allowed the match with Menelaus to proceed smoothly. He must have known he had no hope himself. It was then, so the rumor goes, that he struck the bargain with Tyndareus in return for assuring a peaceful and very profitable wedding for the radiant Helen. Odysseus would get plain Jane Penelope. But I have another idea, and here it is. Tyndareus and my father Icarus were both kings of Sparta. They were supposed to rule alternately, one for a year and the other the next, turn about. But Tyndareus wanted the throne for himself alone, and indeed he later got it. It would stand to reason that he sounded out the various suitors on their prospects and their plans, and had learned that Odysseus shared the newfangled idea that the wife should go to the husband family rather than the other way around. It would suit Tyndareus fine if I could be sent far away, me and any sons I might bear. That way there would be fewer to come to the aid of Icarus in the event of an open conflict. Whatever was behind it, Odysseus cheated and won the race. I saw Helen smiling maliciously as she watched the marriage rites. She thought I was being pawned off on an uncouth adult who would haul me off to a dreary backwater, and she was not displeased. She'd probably known well beforehand that the fix was in. As for me, I had trouble making it through the ceremony, the sacrifices of animals, the offerings to the gods, the lustral sprinklings, the libations, the prayers, the interminable songs. I felt quite dizzy. I kept my eyes downcast, so all I could see of Odysseus was the lower part of his body. Short legs, I kept thinking, even at the most solemn moments. This was not an appropriate thought. It was trivial, silly, and it made me want to giggle, but in my own defense, I must point out that I was only 15.
Chapter 7, The Scar. And so I was handed over to Odysseus, like a package of meat. A package of meat in a wrapping of gold, mind you. A sort of gilded blood pudding. But perhaps that is too crude a simile for you. Let me add that meat was highly valued among us. The aristocracy ate lots of it. Meat. And all they ever did was roast it. Ours was not an age of hot cuisine. Oh, I forgot. There was also bread. Flat bread, that is. Bread, and wine. We did have the odd fruit or vegetable, but you've probably never heard of these because no one ever put them into the songs much. The gods wanted meat as much as we did, but all we ever got from us was the bones and fat. Thanks to a bit of rudimentary sleight of the hand by Prometheus, only a god would have been deceived by a bag of bad cow parts disguised as good ones, and Zeus was deceived, which goes to show that the gods were not always as intelligent as they wanted us to believe. I can say this now because I'm dead, and I wouldn't have dared to say it earlier. You can never tell when one of the gods might be listening, disguised as beggars, an old friend, or a stranger. It is true that sometimes I doubted their existence, these gods, but during my lifetime I considered it prudent not to take any risk. There was a lot of everything on my wedding feast. Great glistening hunks of meat, great wads of fragrant bread, great flagons of mellow wine. It was amazing that all the guests didn't burst on the spot. They stuffed themselves so full. Nothing helps gluing along so well as eating food you don't have to pay for yourself, as I learned from later experience. We ate with our hands in those days. There was a lot of gnawing and some heavy-duty chewing, but it was better that way. No sharp utensils that could be used to snatch it up and plunge into a fellow guest who might have annoyed you. At any wedding preceded by a contest, there were bound to be a few sore losers, but no unsuccessful suitor lost his temper at my feast. It was as if they failed to win an auction for a horse. The wine was mixed too strong, so there were many fuddled heads. Even my father, King Icarius, got quite drunk. He suspected that he'd had a trick played on him by Tyrannus and Odysseus. He was almost sure they cheated, but he couldn't figure it out how they'd done it, and this made him angry, and when he was angry, he drank even more, and dropped insulting comments about people's grandparents. But he was a king, so there are no duels. Odysseus did not get himself drunk. He had a way of appearing to drink a lot without actually doing it. He told me later that if a man lives by his wits, as he did, he needs to have those wits always at hand and kept them sharp, like axes or swords. Only fools, he said, were given to brag about how much they could drink. It was bound to lead to swelling competitions, and then to inanition and loss of one's powers. And that would be when your enemy would strike. As for me, I couldn't eat a thing. I was too nervous. I sat there shrouded in my bridal veil, hardly daring to glance at Odysseus. I was certain he would be disappointed in me at once when I lifted the veil and made his way in through the cloak and girdle and the shimmering robe in which I had been decked out. But he wasn't looking at me, and neither was anyone else. They were all staring at Helen, who was dispensing dazzling smiles right and left, not missing a single man. She had a way of smiling that made each one of them feel that secretly she was in love with him alone. I suppose it was lucky that Helen was distracting everyone's attention, because it kept them from noticing me and my trembling awkwardness. I wasn't just nervous, I was really afraid. The maids had been filling my ears with tales about how, once I was in the bridal chamber, I would be torn apart as the earth is by the plow, and how painful and humiliating that would be. As for my mother, she stopped swimming around like a porpoise long enough to attend my wedding, for which I was less grateful than I ought to have been. There she sat on her throne beside my father, robed in cool blue, a small puddle gathering at her feet. She did make a little speech to me as the maids were changing my costume, yet again, but I didn't consider it to be a helpful one at the time. It was nothing if not oblique, but then all naiads are oblique. Here's what she said. Water does not resist, water flows. When you plunge your hand into it, all you feel is a caress. Water is not a solid wall, it will not stop you. But water always goes where it wants to go, and nothing in the end can stand against it. Water is patient. Dripping water wears away a stone. Remember that, my child. Remember, you are half water. If you can't go through an obstacle, go around it. Water does. After the ceremonies and the feasting, there was the usual procession to the bridal chamber, with the usual torches and the vulgar jokes and the drunken yelling. The bed had been garlanded, the threshold sprinkled, the libations poured. The gatekeeper had been posted to keep the bride from rushing out in horror, and to stop her friends from breaking down the door and rescuing her when they heard her screams. All of this was play acting. The fiction was that the bride had been stolen, and the consummation of the marriage was supposed to be a sanctioned rape. It was supposed to be a conquest, a trampling of a foe, a mock killing. There was supposed to be blood. Once the door had been closed, Odysseus took me by the hand and sat me down on the bed. "Forget everything you've been told," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you, or not very much. But it would help us both if you could pretend. I've been told you're a clever girl. Do you think you can manage a few screams? That will satisfy them. They're listening at the door. And then they'll leave us in peace, and we can take our time to become friends." This was one of the great secrets of the persuader. He could convince another person that the two of them together faced a common obstacle, and that they need to join forces in order to overcome it. He could not draw almost any listener into a collaboration, a little conspiracy for his own making. Nobody could do it better than he. For once, the stories don't lie, and he had a wonderful voice as well, deep and sonorous, so of course I did as he asked. Somewhat later, I found that Odysseus was not one of those men who, after the fact, simply roll over and begin to snore. Not that I am aware of this common male habit through my own experience, but as I've said, I listened a lot to the maids. No, Odysseus wanted to talk, and as he was an excellent recounter, I was happy to listen. I think this is what he valued the most in me, my ability to appreciate his stories. It was an underrated talent in women. I had occasion to notice the long scar on his thigh, and so he proceeded to tell me the story of how he got it. As I've already mentioned, his grandfather was Autolycus, who claimed the god of Hermes was his father. That may have been the way of saying that he was a crafty old thief, cheat, and liar, and that luck had favored him in these kinds of activities. Autolycus was the father of Odysseus' mother, Anticlea, who married the king of Laertes of Ithaca, and was therefore now my mother-in-law. There was a slanderous item going around about Anticlea, that she'd been seduced by Sisyphus, who was the true father of Odysseus, but I found it difficult to believe, as who would want to seduce Anticlea? It'd be like seducing a pro, but let the tale stand for the moment. Sisyphus was a man so tricky, he was said to have cheated death twice, once by fooling King Hades into putting on handcuffs that Sisyphus refused to unlock, once by talking to Persephone into letting him out of the underworld because he hadn't been properly buried, and thus didn't belong in the dead side of the river Styx. So if we admit the rumor about Anticlea's infidelity, Odysseus had crafty, unscrumptious men on two of the main branches of his family. Whatever the truth is, his grandfather Autolycus, who named him, invited Odysseus to Mount Parnassus to collect the gifts promised him at birth. Odysseus did pay a visit, during which he went boar hunting with the sons of Autolycus. It was a particularly ferocious bear that had gored him in the thigh and given him the scar. There was something in the way Odysseus told the story that made me suspect there was more to it. Why had the boar savaged Odysseus but not the others? Had the boar was hiding out? Had they let him into a trap? Was Odysseus meant to die so that Autolycus could cheat? Wouldn't have to hand over the gifts he owed? Perhaps. I like to think so. I like to think I had something in common with my husband. Both of us had almost been destroyed in our youth by our family members. All the more reason that we should stick together and not to be too quick to trust others. In return for the story about the scar, I told Odysseus my own story about almost drowning and being rescued by ducks. He was interested in it and asked me questions about it, and was sympathetic, everything you would wish a listener to be. "My poor duckling," he said, stroking me. "Don't worry, I would never throw such a precious girl into the ocean." At which point did I some more weeping, and was comforted in ways that were suitable for a wedding night. So by the time morning came, Odysseus and I were indeed friends. As Odysseus had promised he would be, or let me put it another way, I myself had developed friendly feelings towards him, more than that, loving and passionate ones. He behaved as if he reciprocated them, which is not quite the same thing. After some days had passed, Odysseus announced his intention of taking me and my dowry back with him to Ithaca. My father was annoyed by this. He wanted the old customs kept, he said, which meant that he wanted both of us and our newly gained wealth right there under his thumb. But we had the support of Uncle T, whose son-in-law was Helen's husband, the powerful Menelaus, so Icarus had to back down. You've probably heard that my father ran after our departing chariot, begging me to stay with him, and that Odysseus asked me if I was going to Ithaca with him of my own free will, or did I prefer to remain with my father. It's said that in the answer I pulled down my veil, being much too honest to proclaim in words my desire for my husband, and the statue was later erected in me tribute to my virtue of modesty. There was some truth in the story, but I pulled down my veil to hide the fact that I was laughing. You have to admit that there's something humorous about a father who once tossed his own child to the sea, capering down the road after that child calling, "Stay with me!" I didn't feel like staying at the moment. I could hardly wait to get away from the sparring court. I hadn't been very happy there, and I longed to begin a new life.
Chapter 8. The chorus line, If I Was a Princess, a popular tune. As performed by the maids, with a fiddle, an accordion, and a penny whistle. First maid. If I was a princess, with silver and gold, and loved by a hero, I'd never grow old. Oh, if a young hero came a-marrying me, I'd always be beautiful, happy, and free. Chorus. Then sail, my fine lady, on the billowing wave. The water below is as dark as the grave. And maybe you'll sink in your little blue boat. It's hope and hope only that keeps us afloat. Second maid. I fetch and I carry, I hear and obey. It's yes sir and no ma'am the whole bleeding day. I smile and I nod with a tear in my eye. I make the soft beds in which others do lie. Third maid. O gods, O prophets, please alter my life, and let a young hero take me for his wife. But no hero comes to me early or late. Hard work is my destiny, death is my fate. Chorus. Then sail, my fine lady, on the billowing wave. The water below is as dark as the grave. And maybe you'll sink in your little blue boat. It's hope and hope only that keeps us afloat. The maids all curtsy. Melantho of the pretty cheeks, passing the hat. Thank you, sir, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Chapter 9. The Trusted Kakohen. The sea voyage to Ithaca was long and frightening, and also nauseating, or at least I found it so. I spent most of my time laying down or throwing up, sometimes both at once. Possibly I had an aversion to the ocean due to my childhood experience, or possibly the sea god Poseidon was still annoyed at his failure to devour me. Thus I saw little of the beauties of the sky and clouds that Odysseus reported on his rare visits to see how I was feeling. He spent most of his time either at the bow, peering ahead, I imagined, with a hawk-like gaze in order to spot rocks and sea serpents and other dangers, or at the tiller, or directing the ship in some other way. I didn't know how because I'd never seen the ship before in my life. I gained a great opinion of Odysseus since our wedding day, and admired him immensely, and had inflated notions of his capabilities. Remember, I was 15, so I had the highest confidence in him, and considered him to be the sea captain who could not fail. At last we arrived to Ithaca, and sailed into the harbor, which was surrounded by steep, rocky cliffs. They must have posted outlooks and lit beacons to announce our approach, because the harbor was thronged with people. A certain amount of cheering went on, and a lot of jostling among those who wanted to see what I looked like I was led ashore. Visible proof of the fact that Odysseus had succeeded in his mission and had brought back a noble wife and valuable gifts that came with her. That night there was a feast for the aristocrats of the town. I appeared at it, wearing a shiny veil and one of the best embroidered robes I had brought with me, and accompanied by the maid I had also brought. She was a wedding present to me by my father. Her name was Actress, and she was not happy to be there in Attica with me. She hadn't wanted to leave the luxuries of the Spartan palace and her friends among the servants, and I didn't blame her, as she was not at all young. Even my father would not have been so stupid as to send a blooming girl with me, a possible rival for assiduous affections, especially since one of her tasks was to stand sentinel every night outside her bedroom door to prevent interruptions. She did not last long. Her death left me alone in Ithaca, a stranger among strange people. I did a lot of secluded weeping in those early days. I tried to conceal my unhappiness from Obsidius, as I did not wish to appear unappreciative, and he himself continued to be inattentive and considerate as he has been at first, although his manner was that of an older person to a child. I often caught him studying me, head on one side, chin in hand, as if I were a puzzle, but it was his habit withal, I soon discovered. He told me once that everyone had a hidden door, which was the way into the heart, and it was a point of honor with him to be able to find the handles to those doors. For the heart was both the key and the lock, and he who could master the hearts of men and learn their secrets was but on their way to mastering the fates and controlling the thread of his own destiny. Not, he hastened to add, that any man could really do that. Not even the gods, he said, were more powerful than the three fatal sisters. He did not mention them by name, but spat to avoid bad luck. I shivered to think in their glum cave spending our lives measuring them and cutting them off. Do I have a hidden door to my heart? I asked in what I hope was a winsome and flirtatious manner. And have you found it? At this, Obsidius only smiled. That is for you to tell me, he said. And do you have a door into your heart as well? I said. And have I found the key? I blushed to recall the simpering tone in which I asked this. It was a kind of weeding that Helen might have done, but Obsidius only turned and was looking out the window. A ship has entered the harbor, he said. It's not one I know. He was frowning. Are you expecting news? I asked. I'm always expecting news, he said. Ithaca was no paradise. It was often windy and freely rainy and cold. The nobles were a shabby lot compared to those I was used to, and the palace, although sufficient, was not one I would consider large. There were indeed a lot of rocks and goats, as had been told back home, but there were cows as well, and sheep, and pigs, and grain to make bread, and sometimes a pear or an apple or a fig in season. So we were well supplied at the table, and in time I got more used to the place. Also, to have a husband like Obsidius was no mean thing. Everyone in the region looked up to him, and petitors and others seeking his advice were numerous. Some even came on ships from far away to consult him, as he had a reputation as a man who could undo any complicated knots, though sometimes by tying a more complicated one. His father Latyrus and his mother Artesia were still in the palace at the time. His mother had not yet died, worn out by watching and waiting for Odysseus to return, and, I suspect, by her own bilious digestive system. And his father had not yet quitted the palace in despair at his son's absence, to live in a hovel and penalize himself by farming. All of that would happen once Odysseus had been gone for years, but there was no foreshadowing of it yet. My mother-in-law was circumspect. She was a prune-mouthed woman, and though she gave me a formal welcome, I could tell she did not approve of me. She kept saying I was certainly very young. Obsidius remarked dryly that this was fault that would correct itself in time. The woman who gave me the most trouble at first was Odysseus' former nurse, Erclea. She was widely respected, according to her, because she was so intensely reliable. She had been in the household ever since Odysseus' father had brought her, and so highly had he valued her that he had even slept with her. Imagine that, for a slave woman, she chuckled at me, delighted with herself. And I was very good looking in those days. Some of the maids told me that Latyrus had refrained, not out of respect for Erclea, but out of fear from his wife, who had never had given him any peace if he had been a concubine. Intercalea would freeze the balls of Helios, one of them put it. I knew I should have repented her for impudence, but I could not repress my laughter. Erclea made it a point of taking me under her wing, leading me about the palace to show me where everything was, and as she kept saying, how we do things here. I ought to thank her for it, with my heart as well as my lips, for there is nothing more embarrassing than to make a slip of manners, thus displaying our ignorance of the customs of those around you. Whether to cover your mouth when you laugh, on what occasion to wear a veil, how much of the face should conceal it, how often to order a bath. Hercules was an expert on all such matters. That was looking for my mother-in-law Anticula, who ought to have taken charge in this way, was content to sit silently and say nothing while I was made a fool of myself, a tight little smile on her face. She was happy that her adored son Obsidius had pulled off a coup. A princess of Sparta was not to be sneezed at, but I think she would have been pleased if I had died of seasickness on the way to Ithaca, and Obsidius had arrived home with a bridal present, but not the bride. Her frequent expressions to me was, "You don't look well." So I avoided her when I could, and went around with who was at least friendly. She had a fund of information about all the neighboring noble families in a way that I learned a great many discreditable things about them that would be useful to me later. She talked all the time, and nobody was the world's expert on Odysseus the way she was. She was full of information about how he liked and how he had to be treated, for hadn't she nursed him at her own breast and tended him when he was an infant and brought him up as a youth? Nobody but she must have given him baths, oils for his shoulders, prepare his breakfast, lock up his valuables, and lay out his robes for him, and so on and so forth. She left me with nothing to do, no little offices I might perform for my husband, for if I had tried to carry out any small wifely task, she would have been right there to tell me that wasn't how Odysseus liked things done. Even the road I made for him was not quite right. Too light, too heavy, too sturdy, too flimsy. It will do well enough for the steward, she would say, but not for Odysseus. Nevertheless, she tried to be kind for me in her own way. "We'll have to fatten you up," she would say, "so you have a nice big son for Odysseus. That's your job. You will leave everything else to me," as she was the nearest thing that was to someone I could talk to, besides Odysseus, that is. I came to accept her in time. She did make herself invaluable when Telemachus was born. I am honored bound to say that. She said the prayers to Artemis when I was in too much pain to speak. She held my hand and sponged off my forehead, and caught the baby and washed him, and wrapped him up warmly, for it was one thing she knew, she kept telling me, it was babies. She had a special language for them, a nonsense language. Oozy woo, she would coo to Telemachus when she was drying him off after his bath, a google woogle poo, and it unsettled me to think of my barreled and deep voiced Obsidius, so skilled in persuasion, so articulate, so dignified as an infant laying in her arms, and having this googling discourse addressed him. But I couldn't begrudge her the care she took care of Telemachus. Her delight of him was boundless. You'd almost thought she would give birth to him. Obsidius was pleased with me. Of course he was. Helen hadn't borne a son yet, he said, which ought to have made me glad, and it did. But on the other hand, why was he still and possibly always thinking of Helen?
Chapter 10. The Chorus Line. The Birth of Telemachus, an Idol. 9 months he sailed the wine-red seas of his mother's blood. Out of the caves of dreaded night, of sleep, of trembling dreams, he sailed. In his frail dark boat, the boat of himself, through the dangerous ocean of his vast mother he sailed, from the distant cave where the threads of men's lives are spun, then measured and then cut, by the 3 fatal sisters intent on their gruesome handcrafts. And the lives of women also are twisted into the strand, and we, the 12 who were later to die by his hand, at his father's relentless command, sailed as well, in the dark frail boats of ourselves, through the turbulent seas of our swollen and sore-footed mothers, who were not royal queens, but a motley piebald collection, bought, traded, captured, kidnapped from serfs and strangers. After the 9-month voyage, we came to shore, beached at the same time as he was, struck by the hostile air, infants when he was an infant, wailing just as he wailed, helpless as he was helpless, but 10 times more helpless as well. For his birth was longed for and feasted, as our births were not. His mother presented a princeling, our various mothers, bawed, merely, lambed, farrowed, lidded, foaled, whelped, and knitted, brooded, hatched out their clutch. We were animal young, to be disposed of at will. Soul drowned in the well, traded, used, discarded when bloomless. He was fathered, we simply appeared. Like the crocus, the rose, sparrows engendered in mud. Our lives were twisted in his life. We also were children when he was a child. We were his pets and his toy things, mock sisters and his tiny companions. We grew as he grew, laughed also, ran as he ran, though sandier, hungrier, and sun-speckled, most days meatless. He saw us as rightfully his, for whatever purpose. He chose to tend him and feed him, to wash him, amuse him, rock him to sleep in the dangerous boats of ourselves. We did not know as we played with him that there in the sand, on the beach of our rocky Goat Island, close by the harbor, that he was foredoomed to swell to our cold-eyed teenage killer. If we had known, would we have drowned him back then? Young children are ruthless and selfish. Everyone wants to live. 12 against 1, he wouldn't have stood a chance, would he? Would we? And only a minute, when nobody else was looking, pushed his still innocent child's head under the water with our own still innocent childish nursemaid hands and blamed it on the waves. Would we have had it in us? Asked the three sisters spinning their blood-red mazes, tangling the lives of men and women together. Only they know how events might have been altered. Only they know our hearts. From us you will get no answer.
Chapter 11. Helen ruins my life. After a time, I became more accustomed to my new home, although I had little authority in it. What with Euryclea and my mother-in-law running all domestic matters and making all household decisions, Odysseus was in control of the kingdom naturally, with his father Lethrus sticking his oar in from time to time, either to dispute his son's decisions or to back them up. In other words, there was the standard family push and pull over whose word was to carry the most weight. All were agreed on one thing: it was not mine. Dinner times were particularly stressful. There were too many undercurrents, too many scolds and growlings on the part of the men, and far too many frost silences encircling my mother-in-law. When I tried to speak to her, she would never look at me while answering, but would address her remarks to a footstool or a table. As repeated conversation with the furniture, these remarks were wooden and stiff. I soon found it was more peaceful just to keep out of things and to confine myself to caring for Telemachus when Euryclea would let me. "You're barely more than a child yourself," she would say, snatching my baby out of my arms. "Here, I'll tend the little darling for a while. You run along and enjoy yourself." But I did not know how to do that. Strolling along the cliffs or by the shore alone with some peasant girl or slave was out of the question. Whenever I went out, I had to take 2 of the maids with me. I had a reputation to keep up, and the reputations of a king's wife is under constant scrutiny. But they stayed several places behind me, as was fitting. I felt like a prize horse on parade, walking in my fancy robes while sailors stared at me and townswomen whispered. I had no friend of my own age and station, so these excursions were not very enjoyable, and for that reason they became rarer. Sometimes I would sit in the courtyard, twisting wool into thread and listening to the maids laughing and singing and giggling in the outbuildings as they went about their chores. When it was raining, I would take up my weaving in the women's quarters. There at least I would have company, as a number of slaves were always at work on the looms. I enjoyed weaving, up to a point. It was slow and rhythmical and soothing, and nobody, even my mother-in-law, could accuse me of sitting idle while I was doing it. Not that she ever said a word to that effect, but there is such thing as a silent accusation. I stayed in our room a lot, the room I shared with Odysseus. It was a fine enough room, with a view of the sea, though not so fine as my room back in Sparta. Odysseus had made a special bed in it, one post of which was wilted from an olive tree that had its roots still in the ground. That way, he said, no one would ever be able to move or displace this bed, and it would be a lucky omen for any child conceived there. This bedpost of his was a great secret. No one knew about it except Odysseus himself and my maid Actress, but she was dead now, and myself. If the word got around about his post, said Odysseus in a mock sinister manner, he would know I'd been sleeping with some other man. And then he said, frowning at me with what was supposed to be a playful way, he would be very cross indeed, and would have to chop me up into little pieces with his sword or hang me from the roof beam. I pretended to be frightened and said I would never think of betraying his big post. Actually, I really was frightened. Nevertheless, our best times were spent in that bed. Once he finished making love, Odysseus always liked to talk to me. He told me many stories about himself, true, and his hunting exploits, and his looting expeditions, and his special bow that nobody but he could string, and how he had always been favored by the goddess Athene because of his inventive mind and his skill at disguises and stratagems, and so on. But other stories as well, how there came to be a curse on the house of Atreus, and how Perseus obtained the hat of invisibility from Hades, and cut off the loathsome Gorgon's head, and how the renowned Theseus and his pal Perithous had abducted my cousin Helen, when she was less than 12 years old, and hidden her away with the intent of casting lots to see which one of them would marry her when she was old enough. Theseus didn't rape her as he might have otherwise have done, because she was only a child, or so it was said. She was rescued by her two brothers, but not before they waged a successful war against Athens to get her back. This was a story I already knew, and I'd heard it from Helen herself. It sounded quite different when she told it. Her story was about how Theseus and Perithous were both in so awe of her divine beauty that they grew faint whenever they looked at her, and could barely come close enough to clasp her knees and beg forgiveness for their audacity. The part of the story she enjoyed the most was the number of men who died in the Athenian war. She took their deaths as a tribute to herself. The sad fact is that people had praised her so often and lavished her with so many gifts and adjectives that it had turned her head. She thought she could do anything she wanted, just like the gods from whom she was conceived. She was descended. I've often wondered whether if Helen hadn't been so puffed up with vanity, we might all have been spared the sufferings and sorrows she brought down on our heads by her selfishness and her deranged lust. Why couldn't she have led a normal life? But no, normal lives were boring, and Helen was ambitious. She wanted to make a name for herself. She longed to stand out from the herd. When Telemachus was a year old, disaster struck. It was because of Helen, as all the world knows by now. The first we heard of the impending catastrophe was from the captain of a Spartan ship that had docked in our harbor. The ship was on a voyage around our outlying islands, buying and selling slaves, and was as usual with guests of a certain status. We entertained the captain to dinner and put him up overnight. Such visitors were a welcome source of news: who had died, who'd been born, who was recently married, who'd killed someone in a duel, who had sacrificed their own child to some god or other. But this man's news was extraordinary. Helen, he said, had run away with the Prince of Troy. This fellow Paris was his name, was a young son of a king Priam, and was understood to be very good looking. It was love at first sight. For 9 days of feasting laid by Menelaus, because of this prince's high standing, Paris and Helen had made moon eyes at each other behind the back of Menelaus, who hadn't noticed a thing. That didn't surprise me, because the man was as thick as a brick and had the manners of a stump. No doubt he hadn't stroked Helen's vanity enough, so she was right for someone who would. Then, when Menelaus had to go away to a funeral, the two lovers had simply loaded up Paris' ship with as much gold and silver as they could carry, and slipped away. Menelaus was now in a red rage, and so was his brother Agamemnon, because of the slight to the family honor. They'd been sent emissaries to Troy, demanding the return of both Helen and the plunder, but these had come back empty-handed. Meanwhile, Paris and the wicked Helen were laughing at them from behind the lofty walls of Troy. It was quite the business, said our guest, with evident relish. Like all of us, he enjoyed it when the high and mighty fell flat on their faces. Everyone was talking about it, he said. And he was listening to this account. Odysseus went white, though he remained silent. That night, however, he revealed to me that the cause of his distress, we've all sworn an oath, he said. We swore on the parts of a cut-up sacred horse, so it's a powerful one. Every man who swore it would now be called on to defend the rights of Menelaus and sail off to Troy and wage war back to get Helen back. He said it wouldn't be easy. Troy was a great power, a much harder nut to crack than Athens, and had been when Helen's brothers had devastated it for some reason. I repressed the desire to say that Helen should have been kept in a locked trunk in a dark cellar because she was poisoned on legs. Instead, I said, "Will you have to go?" I was devastated at the thought of having to stay in Ithaca without Odysseus. What joy would there be for me, alone in a palace? By alone, you will understand that I mean without friends or allies. There would be no midnight pleasures to counterbalance the bossiness of Euryclea and the freezing silence of my mother-in-law. I swore the oath, said Odysseus. In fact, the oath was my idea. It would be difficult for me to get out of it now. Nevertheless, he did try. When Agamemnon and Menelaus turned up, as they were bound to do, along with the fateful third man, Palamedes, who was no fool, not like the others, Odysseus was ready for them. He spread the story around like he'd gone mad, and to back it up, he'd put on a ridiculous peasant's hat and was plowing with an ox and a donkey and sowing the furrows with salt. I thought I was being very clever when I offered to accompany the 3 visitors to the field to witness this pitiful sight. "You'll see," I said, weeping. "He no longer recognizes me, or even our little son. I carry the baby along with me to make a point." It was Penelopiad who found Odysseus out. He grabbed Telemachus from my arms and put him down right in front of the team. Odysseus either had to turn aside or run over his own son. So then he had to go. The other 3 flattered him by saying an oracle had decreed that Troy could not fall without his help. That eased preparations for departure, naturally. Which of us can resist the temptation of being thought indispensable?
Chapter 12. Waiting. What can I tell you about the next 10 years? Odysseus sailed away to Troy. I stayed in Ithaca. The sun rose, traveled across the sky, set. Only sometimes did I think of it as the flaming chariot of Helios. The moon did the same, changing from phase to phase. Only sometimes did I think of it as a silver boat of Artemis. Spring, summer, and fall and winter followed one another in their appointed rounds. Quite often the wind blew. Telemachus grew from year to year, eating a lot of meat, indulged by all. We had news of how the war with Troy was going. Sometimes well, sometimes badly. Minstrels sang songs about the notable heroes: Achilles, Ajax, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Hector, and Aeneas, and the rest. I didn't care about them. I waited only for news of Odysseus. When would he come back and relieve my boredom? He too appeared in these songs, and I relished those moments. There he was making an inspiring speech. There he was uniting the quarreling factions. There he was inventing an astonishing falsehood. There he was delivering sage advice. There he was disguising himself as a runaway slave and sneaking into Troy and speaking with Helen herself, who, the song proclaimed, had bathed him and anointed him with her very own hands. I wasn't so fond of that part. Finally, there was concocting the stratagem of the wooden horse filled with soldiers, and then the news flashed from beacon to beacon. Troy had fallen. There were reports of great slaughtering and looting in the city. The streets ran red with blood. The sky above the palace turned to fire. Innocent boy children were thrown off the cliff, and the Trojan women were parceled out as plunder, King Priam's daughters among them. And finally, the hope for news arrived. The Greek ships had set sail for home, and then nothing. Day after day, I would climb to the top floor of the palace and look out over the harbor. Day after day, there was no sign. Sometimes there were ships, but never the ship I longed to see. Rumors came, carried by other ships. Odysseus and his men had got drunk at their first port of call. The men had mutinied, said some. No, said the others. They'd eaten a magic plant that had caused them to lose their memories, and Odysseus had saved them by having them tied up and carried onto ships. Odysseus had been in a fight with the giant one-eyed Cyclops, said some. No. It was only a one-eyed tavern keeper, said another, and the fight was over non-payment of the bill. Some of the men had been eaten by cannibals, said some. No, it was just a brawl of the usual kind, said others, with ear-bitings and nosebleeds, and stabbings and eviscerations. Odysseus was the guest of a goddess on an enchanted isle, said some. She turned his men into pigs, not a hard job in my view, but had turned them back into men because she fell in love with him and was feeding him unheard of delicacies prepared by her own immortal hands, and the two of them made love deliriously every night. No, said others, it was just an expensive whorehouse, and he was sponging off them at him. Needless to say, the minstrels took up these themes and embroidered them considerably. They always sang the noblest versions in my presence, the ones in which Odysseus was clever, brave, and resourceful, and battling supernatural monsters and beloved goddesses. The one reason he hadn't come home was that a god, the sea god Poseidon, according to some, was against him, because a Cyclops crippled by Odysseus was his son. Or several gods were against him, or the fates, or something. For surely, the minstrels implied, by the way of praising me, only a strong divine power could keep my husband from rushing back as quickly as possible into my lovely wifely arms. The more thickly they laid on it, the more costly were the gifts they expected from me. I always complied. Even obvious fabrication is some comfort when you have a few others. My mother-in-law died, wrinkled up in drying mud and sickened by an excess of waiting, convinced that Odysseus would never return. In her mind, it was my fault, not Helen's. If only I hadn't carried the baby to the plowing ground. Old Eurycles got even older, so did my father-in-law Laertes. He lost interest in the palace life and went off to the countryside to rummage around on one of his farms, where he would be spotted shambling here and there in grubby clothing and muttering about pear trees. I suspected he was going soft in the head. Now I was running the vast estates of Odysseus all by myself. In no way had I prepared for such a task during my early life in Sparta. I was a princess after all, and work was what other people did. My mother, although she'd been a queen, had not set a good example. She didn't care for the kinds of meals favored in the Grand Palace. Since big chunks of meat were the main feature, she preferred, at the very most, a small fish or two, with seaweed garnish. She had the manner of eating raw fish, heads first, and an activity I would watch with chilled fascination. Have I forgotten to tell you, she had small pointed teeth. She disliked ordering the slaves to bow and punishing them, though she might suddenly kill one who was annoying her. She failed to understand that they had value as property, and she had no use at all for weaving and spinning. Too many knots, a spider's work. Leave it to Arachne, she said. As for the chore of supervising the food supplies and the wine cellar and what she called the molten people's gold toys, they were kept in the vast storehouse of the palace. She merely laughed at the thought. Naiads can't count past 3, she would say. Fish come in shoals, not list. 1 fish, 2 fish, 3 fish, another fish, another fish, another fish, another fish. That's how we count them. She laughed her rippling laugh. We immortals aren't misers. We don't hoard. Such things are pointless. Then she'd slip off to take a dip in the palace fountain, or she'd vanish for days to tell jokes to the dolphins and play tricks on clams. So in the palace of Ithaca, I had to learn from scratch. At first I was impelled in this by Euryclea, who wanted to be in charge of everything. But finally she realized that there was too much to be done, even for a busybody like her. As years passed, I found myself making inventories where the slaves are bound. There's bound to be theft, if you don't keep a sharp eye out, and planning the palace menus and wardrobes. The slave garments were coarse, they did fall apart after a while and had to be replaced, so I needed to tell the spinners and weavers what to make. The grinders of corn were on the low of the slave hierarchy and were kept locked in an outbuilding. Usually they were put in there for bad behavior, and sometimes there were fights among them, so I had to be aware of the only animosities and vendettas. The male slaves were not supposed to sleep with the female ones, not without permission. This could be a tricky issue. Sometimes they fell in love and became jealous, just like their betters, which could cause a lot of trouble. If that sort of thing got out of hand, I naturally had to sell them. But if a pretty child was born of these couplings, I would often keep it and rear it myself, teaching it to be a refined and pleasant servant. Perhaps I indulged some of these children too much, Euryclea often said. Melantho of Pretty Cheeks was one of these. Though the steward I traded for supplies had soon had a reputation of as a smart bargainer. Through my foreman, I oversaw the arms of flocks and a point of learning about such things as lambing, cowing, and how to keep a sow from entering her farrow. As I gained expertise, I came to enjoy the conversation about Seth and Koth and dirty matters. It was a source of pride in me when my swabber would come to me for advice. My policy was to build up the estates of Odysseus, so we'd have even more wealth than when he came back than when he left. Mere sheep, mere cows, more pigs, more fields of grain, more slaves. I had such a clear picture in my mind, Odysseus returning to me, and me, with womanly modesty, revealing to him how well I had done at what was usually considered a man's business. On his behalf, of course, always for him, and how his face would shine with pleasure, how pleased he would be with me. You are worth 1,000 Helens, he'd say, wouldn't he? And then he'd clasp me tenderly in his arms. Despite all the busyness and responsibility, I felt more alone than ever. What wise counselors did I have? Who could I depend on really except myself? Many nights I cried myself to sleep, or prayed the gods to bring me either my beloved husband or a speedy death. Euryclea would draw me soothing baths and bring me comforting evening drinks, though these came with a price. She had an irksome habit of reciting folk songs designed to stiffen my upper lip and encourage me in my dedication and hard work, such as, "She who reaps when sun's in sky will never pile the platter high," or "She who wastes times in her moan will ne'er eat a cow when it's grown," or "Mistress lazy, slaves get bold, will not do what they're told. Act a thief or whore or knave, spare the rod and spoil the slave," and more of that ilk. If she'd been younger, I would have slapped her. But her exhortations must have had some effect, because during the daytimes I managed to keep up the appearances and cheerfulness of hope. If not for myself, at least for Telemachus. I'd tell him stories of Odysseus, what a fine warrior he was, how clever, how handsome, and how wonderful everything would be once he got home again. There was an increasing amount of curiosity about me, as there was bound to be about the wife or was it the widow, of such a famous man, foreign ships came with more frequency, bringing new rumors. They brought also the occasional feeler. If Odysseus were proved to have died, the gods forfend might perhaps be open to offer others. To other offers, me and my treasures, I ignore these hints, since news of my husband, dubious news, but news, continue to arrive. Odysseus had been to the land of the dead, consort with the spirits, said some. No, he merely spent the night in a gloomy old cave full of bats, said others. He made his men put wax in their ears, said one, while sailing past the alluring silence, half bird, half woman, who enticed men to their island and then ate them, though he tied himself to the mast so we could listen to their irresistible singing without jumping overboard. No, said another. It was a high-class silicon knocking shop. The courtesans there were known for their musical talents and their fancy feathered outfits. It was hard to know what to believe. Sometimes I thought that they were making things up just to alarm me, and to watch my eyes fill with tears. There's a certain zest to be had in tormenting the vulnerable. Any rumor was better than none. However, so I listened avidly to all. But after several more years, the rumors stopped coming altogether. Odysseus seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth.
Chapter 13. The Chorus Line. The Willy Seep Captain, a Sea Shanty. As performed by the 12 maids in sailor costumes. O Willy Odysseus, he set out from Troy, with his boat full of loot and his heart full of joy, for he was Athene's own shiny-eyed boy, with his lies and his tricks and his thieving. His first port of call was the sweet Lotus shore, where we sailors did long to forget the foul war, but we soon were hauled off on the black ships once more, although we were pining and grieving. To the dread one-eyed Cyclops the next we did hie. He wanted to eat us, so we put out his eye. Our lad said, I'm no one, but then bragged, 'twas I, Odysseus, the prince of deceiving. So there's a curse on his head from Poseidon his foe, that is dogging his heels as he sails to and fro, and a big bag of wind that will boisterously blow Odysseus, the saltiest seaman. Here's health to our captain, so gallant and free, whether stuck on a rock or asleep 'neath a tree, or rolled in the arms of some nymph of the sea, which is where we would all like to be, man. The Lastragonians then we did meet, who dined on our men from their brains to their feet. He was sorry he'd asked them for something to eat, Odysseus, that epical he-man. On the island of Sirte we were turned into swine, till Odysseus bedded the goddess so fine. Then he ate up her cakes, and he drunk up her wine. For a year he became her blithe lodger. So a health to our captain, where'er he may roam, tossed here and tossed there on the wide ocean's foam. And he's in no hurry to ever get home, Odysseus, the crafty old god-creature. To the Isle of the Dead, then he took his way, filled the trench up with blood, held the spirits at bay, till he learned that Tiresias, the seer, had to say, Odysseus, the artfulest dodger. The Siren's sweet singing, the next he did brave. They attempted to lure him into a feathery grave. While tied to the mast he did rant and did rave, but Odysseus alone learned the riddle. The whirlpool Charybdis did not our lad catch, nor snake-headed Celia, she could not him snatch. Then he ran the fell rocks that would grind you to scratch, for their clashing he gave not a piddle. We men did a bad turn against his command. When we ate the sun's cattle, they sure tasted grand. In a storm we all perished, but our captain reached land on the isle of the goddess Calypso. After 7 long years thereof kissing a woo, he escaped on a raft that was drove to and fro, till fair Nausicaa's maids, that the laundry did do, found him bare on the beach, he did drip so. Then he told his adventures, and laid to his door, 100 disasters and sufferings galore, for no one can tell what the fates have in store, not Odysseus, the master disguiser. So a health to our captain, where he may be, whether walking the earth or adrift on the sea, for he's not down in Hades, unlike all of we, and we leave you not any the wiser.
Chapter 14. The suitors stuff their faces. I was wandering in the field the other day, if it was a day, nibbling on some asphodel, when I ran to Antinous. He usually struts about in his finest cloak and his best robe, golden brooches and all, looking deliberate and haughty and showing aside some other spirits. But as soon as he sees me, he assumes his guise of his own corpse, with blood spurting down all his front and an arrow through his neck. He was first of the suitors that Odysseus shot. This performance of his with an arrow is meant as a reproach, or so we intended, but it doesn't cut any ice with me. The man was a pest when he was alive, and a pest he remains. Greeting, Antinous, I said to him. I wish you take the arrow out of your neck. It is an arrow of my love, Penelope of the divine form, fairest and most sagacious of all women, he replied. Although it came from the renowned bow of Odysseus, in reality the cruel archer was Cupid himself. I wear it as a remembrance of the great passion I bore for you, and carried it to my grave. He goes on as a spurious way quite a lot, having a good deal of practice at it while he was alive. Come now, Antinous, I said. We're done now. You don't have to blather on in this fatuous manner down here. You have nothing to gain by it. There is no need for your trademark hypocrisy. So be a good fellow for once and eject the arrow. It does nothing to improve your appearance. He gazed at me ludicrously, with eyes like a whipped spaniel, mercilessly in life, mercilessly in death, he sighed. But the arrow vanished and the blood disappeared, and his greenish-white complexion turned to normal. Thank you, I said. That's better. Now we can be friends, and as a friend you can tell me, why did you suitors risk your life by acting in such an outrageous way towards me, towards Obsidius, not once but for years and years? It's not that you weren't warned. Prophets foretold your doom, and Zeus himself sent birds, potent and significant thundering. Antinous sighed. The god wanted to destroy us, he said. That's everyone's excuse for behaving badly, I said. Tell me the truth. It was hardly my divine beauty. I am 35 years old by the end of it. I worn out by care and weeping, and we both know I was getting quite fat around the middle. You suitors were born when Obsidius set out for Troy, or else you were babies like my son, Telemachus, or you were children at the very most, so all the practical purposes I was old enough to be your mother. You blabbled on about how I made your knees melt and how you longed to have me share your bed and bear your children, yet you knew perfectly well I was all but past childbearing age. You could have probably squeezed out one or two little brats, Antinous replied nastily. You could barely suppress a smirk. That's more like it, I said. I prefer straightforward answers. So what was your real motive? We wanted the treasure trove naturally, he said, not to mention the kingdom. This time he had a impudence to laugh outright. What young man wouldn't want to marry a rich and famous widow? Widows are supposed to be consumed with lust, especially if their husbands have been missing or dead for such a long time, as yours was. You weren't exactly Helen, but we could have dealt with that. The darkness conceals much. All the better that you were 20 years older than us. You'll die first, perhaps, with a little help. Then, furnished with your wealth, we could have had our pick of any young and beautiful princesses we wanted. You didn't really think we would madden by love for you, did you? You may not have been much to look at, but you're always intelligent. I'd say I prefer straightforward answers, but of course nobody does, not when the answers were so unflattering. Thank you for your frankness, I said coldly. It must be a relief for you to express your real feelings for once. You can put the arrow back now. To tell you the truth, I felt a surge of joy every time seeing it stick through your laying, gluturous neck. The suitors did not appear on the scene right away. For the first 9 or 10 years of Obsidian's absence, we knew where he was. He was at Troy, and we knew that he was still alive. No, they didn't start besieging the palace until hope had dwindled and was flickering out. First 5 came, then 10, then 50, then there were more, then the more attracted, more fearing to miss out on the prejudicial feasting and the marriage lottery. They were like vultures when they spot a dead cow. One drops, then another, until finally every vulture from a mile away is tearing at the carcass. They simply showed up every day at the palace and proclaimed themselves as my guests, imposing upon me as their host. Then, taking advantage of my weakness and lack of manpower, they helped themselves to our livestock, butchering the animals themselves, roasting the flesh with the help of their servants, ordering the maids about, and pinching their bottoms as if they were in their own homes. It was astonishing the amount of food they could cram into themselves. They gorged as if their legs were hollow. Each one ate if they outdo all the others at eating. Their goal was to wear down my resistance with the threat of impoverishment. So mountains of hillhawk of bread and rivers of wine vanished down their throats as if the earth opened up and swallowed down everything. They said it would continue to this matter until I chose one of them to be my new husband. So they punctured their drunken parties and merrymaking and immoderate speeches as my ravishing beauty and my excellent wisdom. I couldn't pretend that I didn't enjoy a certain amount of this. Everybody does. We like to hear songs of our praise, even if we don't believe them. But I tried to view their antics as one might view a spectacle or a piece of buffoonery. What new smells might they employ? Which one would pretend most convincingly to swoon with rapture of the sight of me? Once in a while I would make an appearance in the hall where they were feasting, backed by two of my maids, just to watch them outdo themselves. Ambifinus usually won on the grounds of good manners, although he was far from being the most virtuous. I have to admit that I occasionally daydreamed about which one I would rather go to bed with, if it came to that. Afterwards, the maids would tell me what pleasantries the suitors were exchanging behind my back. They were all well positioned to eavesdrop as they were forced to help serve the meat and drink. What did the suitors have to say about me among themselves? Here are a few examples. First prize, a week in Penelope's bed. Second prize, 2 weeks in Penelope's beds. Close your eyes and they're all the same. Just imagine Helen. That'll put bronze in your spirit, haha. When there's an old bitch going to make up her mind, let's murder the son, get him out of the way while he's young. The little bastard's starting to get on my nerves. What's to stop one of us from grabbing the old cow and making off with her? No, lads, that would be cheating. You know our bargain. Whoever gets the prize gets the most respectable gifts of the others. We agreed, right? We're all in this together, do or die. You do, she dies, because whoever wins has to fuck her to death. Haha. Sometimes I wondered whether the maids were making some of this up, out of spite or just to tease me. They seemed to enjoy the reports they brought, especially when I dissolved in tears and prayed to the grey-eyed Athena either to bring Odysseus back or put an end to my suffering. That they could dissolve into tears as well. They weep and wail and bring me comforting drinks. It relieved their nerves. Ercleia was especially diligent in reporting the most malicious gossip, whether true or invented. Most probably that she was trying to harden my heart against the suitors and their indolent pleas. I would remain faithful to the very last grasp. She was always Osirius' biggest fan. What could I do to stop these aristocrat young thugs? They were at the age when they were all swagger, so appeal to their generosity, attempts to reason with them, and threats of retribution alike had no effect. Not one of them would back down to fear the others would jeer at him and call him a coward. Remonstrating with their parents did no good. Their families stood to gain from their behavior. Telemachus was too young to oppose them, and in any case he was the only one, and there were 112 or 108 or 120. It was hard to keep track of the number. There were so many. The men who might have been loyal to Odysseus sailed off with him to Troy, and those remaining who might have taken a side were intimidated by the sheer force of numbers and afraid to speak up. I knew it would do no good to try to expel my unwanted suitors, or to bar the palace doors against them. If I tried that, they would turn really ugly and go on a rampage and snatch by force what they were attempting to win by persuasion. But I was the daughter of a naiad. I remembered my mother's advice to me. Behave like water, I told myself. Don't try to oppose them. When they try to grasp you, slip through their fingers, flow around them. For this reason, I pretended to view their wooing favorably, in theory. I even went as far to encourage one, then another, or to send them secret messages. I told them before choosing among them I had to be satisfied in my mind that Odysseus would never return.
Chapter 15. The Shroud. Month by month, the pressure on me increased. I spent whole days in my room, not the room I used to share with Odysseus. No, I couldn't bear that, but in a room of my own in the women's quarters. I would lie on my bed and weep and wonder what on earth I should do. I certainly didn't want to marry any of those mannerless young whelps, but my son Telemachus was growing up. He was almost the same age as the suitors, more or less, and he was starting to look at me in an odd way, holding me responsible for the fact that his inheritance was being literally gobbled up. How much easier for him it would be if I would just pack up and go back to my father, King Icarius, in Sparta. The chances of my doing that of my own free will were zero. I had no intentions of being hurled into the sea a second time. Telemachus initially thought my return to the home palace would be a fine outcome from his point of view, but on second thought, after he'd done the math, he realized that a good part of the gold and silver in the palace would go back with me, as it had been my dowry. And if I stayed in Ithaca and married one of the noble puppies, that puppy would become the king and his stepfather, and would have authority over him. Being ordered around by a lad no older than himself did not appeal. Really, the best solution for him would have been a graceful death on my part, one for which he was in no way to blame. For if he did as Orestes had done, but with no cause, unlike Orestes, and murdered his mother, he would attract the Erions, the dreaded Furies, snake-haired, dog-headed, bat-winged, and they would pursue him with their barking and hissing, and their whips and scourges, until they had driven him insane. And since he would have killed me in cold blood, and for the basest of motives, the acquisition of wealth, it would be impossible for him to obtain purification at any shrine, and would be polluted with my blood until he died, a horrible death in a state of raving madness. A mother's life is scared. Even a badly behaved mother's life is sacred. Witness my foul cousin Clytemnestra, adulteress, butcher of her husband, tormentor of her children, and nobody said I was a badly behaved mother. But I did not appreciate the barrage of surly monosyllables and resentful glances I was getting from my own son. When the suitors had started their campaign, I had reminded them that the eventual return of Odysseus had been foretold by an oracle. But as he failed to turn up year after year, faith in the oracle began to wear thin. Perhaps it had been misinterpreted. The suitors declared oracles were notoriously ambiguous. Even I began to doubt, and at last I had to agree, at least in public, that Odysseus was probably dead. Yet his ghost had never appeared to me in a dream, as would have been proper. I could not believe that he would fail to send me word of any kind from Hades, should he have been to have reached that shady realm. I kept trying to think of a way to postpone the day of decision without reproach to myself. Finally, a scheme occurred to me. When telling the story later, I used to say that it was Pallas Athene, goddess of weaving, who'd given me this idea. And perhaps this was true, for all I know, but crediting some god for one's inspirations was always a good way to avoid accusations of pride, should the scheme succeed as well as the blame if it did not. Here is what I did. I set up a large piece of weaving on my loom and said it was a shroud for my father-in-law. Later, since it would be impious of me not to provide a costly winding sheet for him in the new event that he should die, not until this sacred work was finished could I even think of choosing a new husband, but once it was completed, I would speedily select the lucky man. Laertes was not very pleased by this kind thought of mine. After he heard of it, he kept away from the palace more than ever. What if some impatient suitor should hasten his end, forcing me to bury Laertes in the shroud, ready or not, and thus precipitating my own wedding? No one could oppose my task. It was so extremely pious. All day I would work away at my loom, weaving diligently and saying melancholy things like, This shroud would be a fitter garment for me than for Laertes. Wretched that I am, and doomed by the gods to a life that is a living death. But at night I would undo what I had accomplished, so the shroud never got any bigger. To help me in this laborious task, I chose 12 of my maid servants, the youngest ones, because these had been with me all their lives. I had bought them or acquired them when they were small children, brought them up as playmates for Telemachus, and trained them carefully in everything they would need to know around the palace. They were pleasant girls, full of energy. They were a little loud and giggly sometimes, as all maids are in youth, but it cheered me up to hear them chatting that way, and to listen to their singing. They had lovely voices, all of them, and they had been taught well how to use them. They were my most trusted eyes and ears in the palace, and it was they who helped me to pick away at my weaving, behind locked doors, at dead of night, and by torchlight, for more than 3 years. Though we had to do it carefully and talk in whispers, these nights had a touch of festivity about them, a touch even of hilarity. Melantho of the pretty creek smuggled in treats for us to nibble on. Figs in season, bread dipped in honeycomb, heated wine in the winter. We told stories as we worked away at our task of destruction. We shared riddles. We made jokes. In the flickering light of the torches, our daylight faces were softened and changed. In our daylight manners, we were almost like sisters. In the mornings, our eyes darkened by lack of sleep, we'd exchange smiles of complicity, and here and there a quick squeeze of the hand. Their yes ma'ams and no ma'ams hovered on the edge of laughter, as if neither they nor I could take their servile behavior seriously. Unfortunately, one of them betrayed the secret of my interminable weaving. I'm sure it was an accident. The young were careless, and she must have slipped a hint or a word. I still don't know which one. Down here among the shadows, they all go about in a group, and when I approach them, they could run away. They shunned me as if I had done them a terrible injury, but I never would have hurt them, not on my own accord. The fact that my secret was betrayed was, strictly speaking, my own fault. I told my 12 young maids, the loveliest, the most beguiling, to hang around the suitors and spy on them, using whatever enticing arts they could invent. No one knew of my instructions but myself and the maids in question. I chose not to share the secret with Euryclea, in hindsight a grave mistake. This plan became to grief. Several of the girls were unfortunately raped, others were seduced or were hard pressed, and decided that it was better to give in than to resist. It was not unusual for the guest in a large household or palace to sleep with the maids. To provide a lively night's entertainment was considered part of a good host's hospitality. And such a host would magnanimously offer his guests their pick of the girl, but it was most irregular for the servants to be used in this way without the permission of the master of the house. Such an act amounted to thievery. However, there was no master of the house, so the suitors helped themselves to the maids in the same way they helped themselves to the sheep and pigs and goats and cows. They probably thought nothing of it. I comforted the girls as best I could. They felt quite guilty, and the ones that had been raped needed to be tended and cared for. I put this task into the hands of old Euryclea, who cursed the bad suitors and bathed the girls, and rubbed them with my own perfume olive oil for a special treat. She grumbled a bit about doing it. Possibly she resented my affection for the girls. She told me I was spoiling them, and they could get ideas above themselves. Never mind, I said to them. You must pretend to be in love with these men. If they think you have taken their side, they'll confide in you, and will know their plans. It's one way of serving your master, and he'll be very pleased with you when he comes home. That made them feel better. I even instructed them to say rude and disrespectful things about me and Telemachus, and about Odysseus as well, in order to further the illusion. They threw themselves into this project with a will. Melantho of the Pretty Creeks was particularly adept at it, and had lots of fun thinking up snide remarks. There is indeed something delightful about being able to combine obedience and disobedience in the same act. Not that the whole charade was entirely an illusion. Several of them did fall in love with the men who had used them so badly. I suppose it was inevitable. They thought I couldn't see what was going on, but I knew perfectly well. I forgave them, however. They were young and inexperienced, and it wasn't every slave girl in Ithaca who could boast of being the mistress of a young nobleman. But love or no love, midnight excursions or none, they continued to report to me any useful information they'd found out. So I foolishly thought myself quite wise. In retrospect, I can see that my actions were ill-considered and caused harm. But I was running out of time and becoming desperate, and I had to use every ruse of stratagem at my command. When they found out about the trick I played on them with the shroud, the suitors broke into my quarters at night and caught me at my work. They were very angry, not least because they'd been fooled by a woman, and they made a terrible scene, and I was put on the defense. I had to promise to finish the shroud as quickly as possible, but after which I would without fail choose one of them as a husband. The shroud itself became a story almost instantly. Penelope's web, it was called. People used to say that of any task that remained mysteriously unfinished. I did not appreciate the term web. If the shroud was a web, then I was a spider. But I had not been attempting to catch men like flies. On the contrary, I'd merely been trying to avoid entanglement myself.
Chapter 16, Bad Dreams. Now began the worst period of my ordeal. I cried so much I thought I would turn into a river or a fountain, as in the old tales. No matter how much I prayed and offered up sacrifices and watched for omens, my husband still didn't return. To add to my misery, Telemachus was now of an age to start ordering me around. I'd run the palace affairs almost single-handedly for 20 years, but now he wanted to assert his authority as the son of Odysseus and take over the reins. He started making scenes in the hall, standing up to the suitors in a rash way that I was certain was going to get him killed. He was bound to embark on some foolhardy adventure or other, as young men will. Sure enough, he snuck off in a ship to go chasing around looking for news of his father, without even so much as consulting me. It was a terrible insult, but I couldn't dwell on that part of it, because my favorite maids brought me the news that the suitors, having learned of my husband's daring escape, were sending a ship of their own to lie in wait for him and ambush him and kill him on his return voyage. It's true that the herald Medon revealed this plot to me as well, just as the songs relate, but I already knew about it from the maids. I had to appear to be surprised, however, because otherwise Medon, who was neither on one side nor the other, would have known I had my own sources of information. Well, naturally, I staggered around and fell onto the threshold and cried and wailed, and all of my maids, my 12 favorites, and the rest of them joined in my lamentations. I reproached them all for not having told me of my son's departure, and for not stopping him, until that interfering old biddy Euryclea confessed that she alone had aided and abetted him. The only reason the two of them hadn't told me, she said, was that they hadn't wanted me to fret, but all would come out fine in the end, she added, because the gods were just. I refrained from saying I'd seen scant evidence of that so far. When things get to dismissal, after I've done so much weeping as possible without turning myself into a pawn, I have always, fortunately, been able to go to sleep. When I sleep, I dream. I had a whole run of dreams that night, dreams that have not been recorded, for I never told them to a living soul. In one, Odysseus was having his head bashed in and his brains eaten by Cyclops. In another, he was leaping into the water from his ship and swimming towards the Sirens, who were singing with ravishing sweetness, just like my maids, but were already stretching out their birds' claws to tear him apart. In yet another, he was making love with a beautiful goddess and enjoying it very much. Then the goddess turned into Helen. She was looking at me over the bare shoulder of my husband with a malicious little smirk. The last was such a nightmare that it woke me up. I prayed that it was a false dream sent from the cave of Morpheus, through the gate of ivory, not a true one sent through the gate of horn. I went back to sleep, and at last managed a comforting dream. This one I did relate. Perhaps you have heard of it. My sister, if the meme, who was much older than I was, that I hardly knew her, and who had been married and moved far away, came into my room instead of by my bed, and told me that she had been sent by Athene herself, because the gods didn't want me to suffer. Her message was that Telemachus would return safely. But I questioned her about Odysseus. Was he alive or dead? She refused to answer and slipped away. So much for the gods not wanting me to suffer. They all tease. I might as well have been a stray dog, pelted with stones, or with its tail set alight for their amusement. Not the fat and bones of animals, but our suffering. It is what they love to savor.
Chapter 17. The Chorus Line. Dreamboat's a Ballad. Sleep is the only rest we get. It's when we are at peace. We do not have to mop the floor and wipe away the grease. We are not chased around the hall and tumbled in the dirt by every dimwit nobleman who wants a slice of skirt. When we sleep, we like to dream. We dream we are at sea. We sail the waves in golden boats, so happy, clean, and free. In dreams we are beautiful, in glossy crimson dresses. We sleep with every man we love. We shower him with kisses. They fill our days with feasting. We fill our nights with song. We take them in our golden boats and drift the whole year long. In all is mirth and kindness. There is no tears of pain, for our decrees are merciful throughout our golden reign. But when the morning wakes us up, once more we toil a slave, unhoist our skirts for every man, for every prick and knave.
Chapter 18. News of Helen. Telemachus avoided the ambush set for him, more by good luck more than good planning, and reached home in safety. I welcomed him with tears of joy, and so did the maids. I am sorry to say that my only son and I had a big fight. You have the brains of a newt, I raged. How dare you take one of the boats and go off like that, without even asking permission? You're barely more than a child. You have no experience at commanding a ship. You could have been killed 50 times over. And then what would your father have to say when he gets home? Of course, it would be all my fault for not keeping a better eye on you, and so on. It's not the right line to take. Telemachus got up on his high horse. He denied that he was a child any longer, and proclaimed his manhood. He'd come back, hadn't he, which was proof enough that he'd known what he was doing. Then he defied my parental authority by saying he didn't need anyone's permission to take a boat that was more or less part of his own inheritance. But it was no thanks to me that he had any inheritance left, since I hadn't defended it, and now it was all being eaten up by the suitors. He then said he'd made the decision he had to make. He'd gone in search of his father, since no one else seemed prepared to lift a finger in that direction. He claimed his father would have been proud of him for showing some backbone and getting out from under the thumbs of women, who as usual were being over-emotional and showing no reasonableness and judgment. By the women he meant me. How could he refer to his own mother as the woman? What could I do but burst into tears? And then made is this all the thanks I get? You have no idea what I've been through for your sake. No woman should have to put up with this sort of suffering. I might as well kill myself speech. But I'm afraid he'd heard it before, and showed his folded arms and rolled up eyes that he was irritated by it, and was waiting for me to finish. That done, we settled down. Telemachus had a nice bath drawn for him by the maids. They gave him a good scrubbing and some fresh clothes, and then they brought him a lovely dinner for him and for some friends he invited over. Piraeus and Theoclymenus were their names. Pyrrhus was Ithacan and had been in cahoots with my son on a secret voyage. I resolved to have a word with him later, and to speak to his parents about letting him run so wild. Theoclymenus was a stranger. He seemed nice enough, but I made a mental note to find out what I could about his ancestry, because boys the age of Telemachus can easily get into the wrong company. Telemachus wolfed down on the food and knocked back the wine. I reproached myself for not having taught him better table manners. Nobody could say I hadn't tried, but every time I remonstrated with him, the old hen Euryclea had interposed. Come now, my child, let the boy enjoy his dinner. There be all the time in the world for manners once he's grown up, and much more in that vein. As a twig is bent, so will the tree grow, I would say. And that's just it, she would cackle. We don't want to bend the little twiggy dewy. Oh no, oh nosy, no. We want him to grow straight and tall, and get the juicy goodness out of his nice big hunk of meat without our crosspatch mummy making him all sad. Then the maids would giggle and heap his plate and tell him what a fine boy he was. I'm sorry to say he was quite spoiled. When the three young men had finished eating, I asked about the trip. Had Telemachus found out anything about Odysseus and his whereabouts having been the object of his excursion? And if he had indeed discovered something, could he possibly bring himself to share this discovery with me? You can see things were a little frosty on my part. It's hard to lose an argument to one's teenage son. Once they're taller than you are, you have only your moral authority, a weak weapon at best. What Telemachus said next surprised me a good deal. After dropping in on King Nestor, who could tell him nothing, he'd gone off to visit Menelaus. Menelaus himself, Menelaus the rich, Menelaus the thick-head, Menelaus of the loud voice, Menelaus the cuckold, Menelaus, the husband of Helen, cousin Helen, Helen the lovely, Helen the septic bitch, root cause of all my misfortunes. And did you see Helen? I asked in a somewhat constricted voice. Oh yes, he said. She gave us a very good dinner. He then launched into some rigmarole about the old man of the sea, and how Menelaus had learned from this elderly and dubious sounding gentleman that Odysseus was trapped on the island of a beautiful goddess, where he was forced to make love with her every night. By this time I'd heard one beautiful goddess story too many. And how was Helen? I asked. She seemed fine, said Telemachus. Everyone told stories about the war at Troy. They were great stories, a lot of fighting and combat and guts spilling out. My father was in them. But when all the old vets started blubbering, Helen spiked the drinks, and then we laughed a lot. No, but I asked, how did she look? As radiant as gold and Aphrodite, he said. It was a real thrill to see her. I mean, she's so famous and part of history and everything. She was absolutely everything she's cracked up to be and more. He grinned sheepishly. She must be getting a little older by now, I said calmly as I could. Helen could not possibly still be as radiant as golden Aphrodite. It would not be within nature. Oh well, yeah, said my son. And now that bond which is supposed to exist between mothers and fatherless sons finally asserted itself. Telemachus looked into my face and read its expression. Actually, she did look quite old, he said. Way older than you, sort of worn out, all wrinkly, he added, like an old mushroom, and her teeth are yellow. Actually, some of them have fallen out. It was only after we'd had a lot to drink that she still looked beautiful. I think he was lying, but was touched that he was lying for my sake. Not for nothing was he the great-grandson of Autolycus, friend of Hermes the arch-cheat, and son of wily Odysseus of the soothing voice, fruitful in false invention, persuader of men and deluder of women. Maybe he had some brains after all. Thank you for all you have told me, my son, I said. I'm grateful for it. I will now go and sacrifice a basket of wheat and pray for your father's safe return. And that is what I did.
Chapter 19. Yelp of Joy. Who is to say that prayers have any effect? On the other hand, who is to say they don't? I picture the gods dwindling around on Olympus, wallowing in the nectar and emduous, an aroma of burning bones and fat, mischievous as a pack of 10-year-olds with a sick cat to play with and a lot of time on their hands. Which prayer shall we answer today? They asked one another, "Let's cast dice. Hope this is the one, despair for that one, and while we're at it, let's destroy the life of that woman over there by having sex with her in the form of a crayfish." I think they pull a lot of their pranks because they're bored. 20 years of my prayers have gone unanswered, but finally, not this one. No sooner had I performed a familiar ritual of shed the tears of Odysseus shambled in the courtyard. The shambling was part of the disguise, naturally. I would have expected no less from him. Evidently, he appraised the situation in the palace, the suitors, their wasting of estates, their murderous intent towards Telemachus, and appropriation of the sexual advantages of his maid, and their attempt to wife grab, and wisely concluded that he shouldn't simply march and announce that he was Odysseus and order them to vacate the premises. If he tried that, he would been a dead man within minutes. So he was dressed as a dirty old beggar. He could count on the fact that most of the suitors did not know what he looked like, having been too young or not even born when he sailed away. His disguise was well enough done. I hoped the wrinkles and baldness were part of the act, not real. But as soon as I saw the barrel chest and those short legs, I had a deep suspicion, which became a certainty when I heard he'd broken the neck of a belligerent fellow panhandler. That was his style. Stealthy when necessary, true, but he was never against the direct assault method when he was certain he could win. I didn't let on that I knew. It would have been dangerous for him. Also, if a man takes pride in his disguising skills, it would be foolish wife who would claim to recognize him. It's always a impudence to step in between a man and the reflection of his own cleverness. Telemachus was on the deception. I could see that well. He was by a spinner of falsehood like his father, but he was not very good at it. When he introduced the supposed beggar, his shuffling and his stammering and his side-to-side looks came away. That introduction didn't happen until later. Odysseus spent his first hours in the palace snooping around and being abused by the suitors, who jeered and threw things at him. Unfortunately, I could not tell my 12 maids who he really was, so they continued their rudeness to Telemachus and joined the suitors in their insults. Mantitho of the pretty cheeks was particularly cutting, I was told. I resolved to interpose myself when the time was right, and to tell Odysseus that the girls had been acting under my direction. When evening came, I arranged to see the supposed beggar in the now empty hallway. He claimed to have the news on Odysseus. He spun a plausible yarn and assured me that Odysseus would come home soon. I shed tears and said I feared it was not so, and the travelers had been telling me the same sort of thing for years. I described my suffering at length and my longing for my husband. Better he should hear all this while in the guise of a vagabond, as he would be more inclined to believe it. Then I flattered him by consulting him for advice. As resolved, I said, to bring out the great bow of Odysseus, the one which with he shot an arrow through 12 circular axe handles, an astonishing accomplishment, and challenged the suitors to duplicate the feat, offering myself as a prize. Surely that would bring an end, one way or another, to the intolerable situation in which I found myself. What did he think of that plan? He said it was an excellent idea. The songs claimed that the arrival of Odysseus and my decision to set the test of the bow and axe conceded the incident, or divine plan, which was our way of putting it. Now that we've heard the plain truth, I knew that Odysseus would be able to perform this archery trick. I knew that the beggar was Odysseus. There was no coincidence. I set a whole thing on purpose. Growing confidential with the purported seedy tramp, I then related a dream of mine. It concerned my flock of lovely white geese of which I was very fond. I dreamt that they were happily pecking around the yard when a huge eagle with a crowed beak swooped down and killed them all. Upward I wept and wept. Odysseus the beggar interrupted the dream for me. The eagle was my husband, the geese were the suitors, and the one would surely slay the others. He said nothing about the crooked beak of the eagle, or my love for the geese, my anguish for their deaths. In the event Odysseus was wrong about the dream, he was indeed the eagle, but the geese were not the suitors. The geese were my 12 maid, and as I soon learned, my unending sorrow. There's a detail they make much in a song. I ordered the maids to wash the feet of Odysseus the Impending. and he refused, saying he could only allow his feet to be washed by one who would not deride him for being garnered and poor. I then proposed Ercilia for the task, a woman whose feet were as lacking in aesthetic value as his own. Grumbling, she set on to work, not suspecting the booby trap I placed ready for her. Soon she found the long scar familiar to her from many times she's performed the same service for Odysseus. At this point, she let out a yelp of joy and upset the basin of water all over the floor. Odysseus almost thought her to keep her from giving him away. The songs say I didn't notice a thing because Athena had distracted me. If you believe that, you believe all sorts of nonsense. In reality, I turned my back on the two of them to hide my silent laughter at the success of my little surprise.
Chapter 20. Slanderous Gossip. At this point, I feel like I must address the various items of slanderous gossip that have been going the rounds for the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. These stories are completely untrue. Many have said that there's no smoke without fire, but that is a fatuous argument. We've all heard rumors that later proved to be entirely groundless, and so it is with these rumors about me. The charges concern my sexual conduct. It is alleged, for instance, that I slept with Amyntas, the politest of the suitors. The songs say I found the conversation agreeable, or more agreeable than that of the others, and this is true. But it's a long jump from there into bed. It's also true that I led the suitors on and made private promises to some of them. But this was a matter of policy. Among other things, I used my supposed encouragement to extract expensive gifts from them, scant return for everything they'd eaten and wasted, and I draw your attention to the fact that Odysseus himself witnessed and approved of my action. The more outrageous versions that have it that I slept with all of the suitors, one after another, over 100 of them, and then gave birth to the great god Pan. Who could believe such a monstrous tale? Some songs aren't worth the breath expended on them. Various commentators have cited my mother-in-law, Anticlea, who said nothing about the suitors when Odysseus spoke to her spirit on the island of the dead. Her silence is taken as proof. If she'd mentioned the suitors at all, they say, she would have to mention my infidelity as well. Maybe she did mean to plant a toxic seed in the mind of Odysseus. But you already know that about her attitude towards me. It would have been her final acid touch. Others have noted the fact that I did not dismiss or punish the 12 impudent maids, or shut them up in an outbuilding to grind corn. So I must have been indulging to the same kind of sluttery myself. But I have explained all that. A more serious charge is that Odysseus didn't reveal himself to me when he first returned. He distrusted me, it said, and wanted to make sure I wasn't having orgies in the palace. But the real reason was that he was afraid I would cry tears of joy, and thus give him away. Similarly, he had me locked in the women's quarters with the rest of the women when he was slaughtering the suitors, and he relied on Euclia's help, not on mine. But he knew me well, my tender heart, my habit of dissolving in tears and falling down on thresholds. He simply didn't want to expose me to dangers and disagreeable sights. Surely that is the obvious explanation for his behavior. If my husband had learned of slanders during our lifetimes, he certainly would have ripped out a few tongues, but there's no sense in brooding over lost opportunities.
Chapter 21, The Chorus Line, The Perilous of Penelope, a Drama. Prologue, spoken by Melithano of the Pretty Cheeks. As we approach the climax, grim and gory, let us just say there is another story, or several, as benefits the goddess Rumor, who's sometimes in a good or else bad humor. Word has it that Penelope the Prissy was, when it came to sex, no shrinking sissy. Some said that Amphimius she was sleeping. masking her lust with gales of moans and weeping. Others, that each and every brisk contender by turns did have the fortune to append her, by which promiscuous acts the goat god plan was then conceived, or so the parable ran. The truth, dear auditors, is seldom certain, but let us take a peek behind the curtain. Eurycleia, played by a maid. Dear child, I fear you are undone. Alack, the master has returned, that's right, he's back. Penelope, played by a maid. I knew him, as he walked from afar, by his short legs. Eurycleia, and I by his long scar. Penelope, and now, dear nurse, the fat is in the fire. Chop me up for tending my desire. While he was pleasuring every nymph and beauty, did he think I do nothing but my duty? While every girl and goddess he was praising, did he assume I dry up like a raisin? Eurycleia, while you were your famous loom claimed to be threading, in fact you were at work within the bedding, and now there's ample matter for beheading. Penelope, Amphidamus, quick, down the hidden stairs, and I'll sit here and fiend great woes and cares. Do up my robe, bind fast my wanton hairs, which of the maids is in on my affairs? Eurycleia, only the 12, my lady, who assisted. Know that the suitors you have not resisted. They smuggled lovers in and out all night. They drew the drapes, and then they held the light. They're privy to your every lawless thrill. They must be silenced, or the beans they'll spill. Penelope, oh then, dear nurse, it's really up to you to save Odysseus' honor too, because he sucked at your ancient bust. You are the only one he of us he'll trust. Point out those maids as feckless and disloyal, snatched by the suitors as unlawful spoil, polluted, shameless, and not fit to be the doting slaves of such a lord as he. Eurycleia will stop their mouths by sending them to Hades. He'll string them up as grubby, wicked ladies. And I in fame, immortal Penelope, and I in fame, immortal wife shall rest. All husbands will look on and think him blessed. But haste, the suitors come to do their wooing, and I, for my part, must begin boo-hooing. The chorus line and tap dance shoes. Blame it on the maids, those naughty little jades. Hang them high and don't ask why. Blame it on the maids, blame it on the slaves, the toys of rogues and knaves. Let them dangle, let them strangle. Blame it on the slaves, blame it on the sluts, those poxy little scuts. We've got the dirt on every skirt. Blame it on the sluts, they all curtsy.
Chapter 22. Helen takes a bath. I was wandering through this photo, musing on times of past, when I saw Helen sauntering my way. She was followed by a customary horde of male spirits, all of them twittering with anticipation. She gave them not even a single glance, though she was evidently conscious of their presence. She always had a pair of invisible antennae that twitched at the merest whiff of a man. "Hello there, little cousin Duck," she said to me with her usual affable condescension. "I'm on my way to take a bath. Care to join me?" "We're spirits now, Helen," I said with what I hoped to smile. "Spirits don't have bodies. They don't get dirty. They have no need for baths." "Oh, but my reason for taking a bath was always spiritual," said Helen, opening her lovely eyes very wide. I found it so soothing in the midst of the turmoil. You wouldn't have any idea how exhausting it is, having vast numbers of men quarreling over you, year after year. Divine beauty is such a burden. At least you've been spared that. I ignored the sneer. "Are you going to take off your spirit robes?" I asked. "We're all aware of your legendary modesty, Penelope," she replied. "I'm sure if you were to ever bathe, you would keep your robes on, as I suppose you did in life, unfortunately." Here she smiled. Modesty was not among the gifts given to me by the laughter-loving Aphrodite. I do prefer to bathe without my robes, even in the spirit. "That would explain the unusually large crowd of spectators you've attracted," I said somewhat tearfully. "But is it unusually large? I do feel that because so many of them died for me. Well, because of me. Surely I owe them something in return." "If only a peek at what they desired they missed on earth," I said. "Desire does not die with the body," said Helen. "Only the ability to satisfy it. But a glimpse or two does not perk them up, the poor lambs." "It gives them a reason to live," I said. "You're being witty," said Helen. "Better late than never, I suppose." "My wittiness or your bare-naked tits and ass bath treat for the dead," I said. "You're such a cynic," said Helen. "Just because we're not, anymore. There's no need to be so negative. And so vulgar. Some of us have a giving nature. Some of us like to contribute what we can to the less fortunate." "So you're washing their blood off your hands," I said. "Figuratively speaking, of course. Making up for all those mangled corpses. I hadn't realized you were capable of guilt. This bothered her. She gave a tiny frown. Tell me, little duck, how many men did Odysseus butcher because of you? Quite a lot, I said. She knew the exact number. She'd long since satisfied herself that total was puny compared with the pyramids of corpses laid at her door. It depends on what you call a lot, said Helen. But that's nice. I'm sure you felt more important because of it. Maybe you felt prettier. She smiled with her mouth only. Well, I'm off now, little duck. I'm sure I'll see you around. Enjoy the asfalto. And she walked away, followed by her excited entourage.
Chapter 23 Odysseus and Telemachus snuffed the maids. I slept through the mayhem. How could I have done such a thing? I suspect Euryclea put something in the comforting drink she gave me, to keep me out of action and stop me from interfering. Not that I would have been in action anyway. Odysseus made sure all the women were locked securely into the women's quarter. Euryclea described the whole thing to me, and to anyone else who would listen. First, she said Odysseus, still in the guise of a beggar, watched while Telemachus set up the 12 axes, and then while the suitors failed to string his famous bow. Then he got hold of the bow himself, and after stringing it and shooting an arrow through the 12 axes, thus winning me as his bride for a second time, he shot Antinous in the throat, threw off his disguise, and made mincemeat of every last one of the suitors, first with arrows, then with spears and swords. Telemachus and 2 faithful herdsmen helped him. Nevertheless, it was a considerable feat. The suitors had a few spears and swords supplied to them by Melanthius, a treacherous goatherd, but none of his hardware was of any help to them in the end. Euryclea told me how she and the other women had cowered near the locked door, listening to the shouts and the sounds of breaking furniture, and the groans of the dying. She then described the horror that happened next. Odysseus summoned her and ordered her to point out the maids who had been, as he called it, disloyal. He forced the girls to haul the dead bodies of the suitors out into the courtyard, including the bodies of their erstwhile lovers, and to wash the brains and gore off the floor, and to clean whatever chairs and tables remained intact. Then, Euryclea continued, he told Telemachus to chop the maids into pieces with the sword. But my son, wanting to assert himself to his father, and to show that he knew better, he was at that age, hanged them all in a row from a ship's hawser. Right after that, said Euryclea, who could not disguise her gloating pleasure, Odysseus and Telemachus hacked off the ears and nose and hands and feet and genitals of Melanthius, the evil goatherd, and threw them to the dogs, paying no attention to the poor man's agonized screams. They had to make an example of him, said Euryclea, to discourage any further defections. But which maids? I cried, beginning to shed tears. Dear gods, which maids did they hang? Mistress, dear child, said Euryclea, anticipating my displeasure. He wanted to kill them all. I had to choose some, otherwise all would have perished. Which ones? I said, trying to control my emotions. Only 12, she faltered. The impertinent ones, the ones who'd been rude, the ones who used to thumb their noses at me, Melantho of the pretty chigs and her cronies, that lot. They were notorious whores. The ones who'd been raped, I said, the youngest, the most beautiful. My eyes and ears among the suitors, I did not add. My helpers during the long nights of the Shroud, my snow-white geese, my thrushes, my doves. It was my fault. I hadn't told her of my scheme. They let it go to their heads, said Euryclea defensively. It wouldn't have done for King Odysseus to allow such impertinent girls to continue to serve in the palace. He could never have trusted them. Now come downstairs, dear child. Your husband is waiting to see you. What could I do? Lamentation wouldn't bring my lovely girls back to life. I bit my tongue. It's a wonder I had any tongue left, so frequently I had bitten it over the years. Dead is dead, I told myself. I'll say prayers and perform sacrifices for their souls, but I'll have to do it in secret, or Odysseus will suspect me as well. There could be a more sinister explanation. What if Euclea was aware of my agreement with the maids, of their spying on the suitors for me, of my orders to them to behave rebelliously? What if she singled them out and had them killed out of resentment and being excluded and the desire to retain her inside position with Odysseus? I haven't been able to confront her about it down here. She's got hold of a dozen dead babies and is always busy tending them. Happily for her, they will never grow up. Whenever I approach and try to engage her in conversation, she says, "Later, my child. Gracious me. I've got my hands full. Look at the itty pretty and wuggle wuggle woo." So I'll never know.
Chapter 24, The Course Line, an Anthropology Lecture, presented by the Maids. What is it that our number, the number of maids, the number 12, suggests to the educated mind? There are 12 apostles, there are 12 days of Christmas, yes, but there are 12 months. But what does the word month suggest to the educated mind? Yes, you, sir in the back. Correct, month comes from moon. As everybody knows, it is no coincidence at all. There were 12 of us, not 11, not 13, not the proverbial 8 maids a milking. For we are not simple maids, we are not mere slaves or brutes. Oh no, surely we are a higher function than that. Could it be that we were not the 12 maids, but the 12 maidens? The 11 moon maidens, companioned by Artemis, vigil but deadly goddess of the moon? Could it be that we are vital sacrifices, devoted priestesses doing our parts, first by indulging in erratic fraternal right behavior with the suitors, then purifying ourselves by washing ourselves in the blood of the slain men victims? Such heaps of them, one honor to the goddess, and renewing our virginity as Artemis renewed hers by bathing in the spring dyed with the blood of Actaeon. We would have willingly sacrificed ourselves as was necessary, reenacting the dark of the moon phase in order that the whole cycle might begin again and the silvery moon goddess rise once more. Why should Iphigenia be credited with the selflessness and devotion more than we? This reading of events in question ties in, excuse the play on words, with the ship's wafser from which we dangle. From the new moon is a boat, and then there is a bow that figures the more prominently in the story. The curved old man bow of Artemis used to shoot an arrow through 12 axed heads. 12. The arrow passes through the loop of their handles and round moon-shaped loops, and hangs itself. Think, dear educated minds, of the significance of the hanging above the earth, up in the air, connected to the moon-governed sea by an umbilical boat-linked rope. Oh, there's too many clues for you to miss. What's that, sir? You in the back. Yes, correct. The number of lunar months is indeed 13, so there ought to have been 13 of us. Therefore, you say smugly, we might add, that our theory about ourselves is incorrect, since we are only 12. But wait, there was in fact 13. The 13th was the high priestess, the incarnation of Artemis herself. She was none other than, yes, Queen Penelope. Thus, possibly, our rape and subsequently hanging represents the overthrowing of the martyrical moon cult by the incoming group of unsurprising per-ethical father god-worshipping barbarians. The chief of them, notably Odysseus, would have claimed kingship by marrying the high priestess of our cult, namely Penelope. No, sir, we deny that this theory is merely unfounded feminist claptrap. We can understand your reluctance to have such thing brought into the open. Rapes and murders were not pleasant subjects, but such overthrows most certainly take place among the Mediterranean Sea, as advocations and prehistoric sites have demonstrated over and over again. Surely those axes, so significant not used as a weapon in ensuring slaughter, so significant and never explained in any satisfactory way by 3,000 years of commentary, surely they must have had the double-bladed retrolateral axes associated with the Great Mother cults among the Minerons, the axes used to lop off the heads of the year king at the end of the term of the 13th lunar month. For the rebelling year king to use her own bow to shoot an arrow through her own ritual life and death axis in order to demonstrate his power over her, just as the patriarchal penis takes upon itself to unilaterally shoot through the... But we're getting carried away here. The patriarchal scheme of things, there may have been a bow shooting contest, but it would have been properly conducted. He who have won it would have declared ritual king for the year, and would have been hanged. Remember, the hanged man motif would survive now only as a lonely tarot card. He would also have his genitals torn off as benefit of the men drone married to the queen bee. Both acts, by hanging of the genital tearing off, would have ensured the fraternal of the crops. But upspringing strongman Odysseus refused to die at the end of his rightful term. Greedy and prolonged life and power, he found substitutes. Genitals were indeed torn off, but they were not his. They belonged to the Garth Methicals. Hanging did indeed take place, but it was we, the 12 moon maidens, who did the swinging in his place. We could go on. Would you like to see some vase painting, some craved gauze cult objects? No, never mind. Point being that you don't have to get too worked up about us, dear educated minds. You don't have to think of us as real girls, real flesh and blood, real pain, real injustice, that we might be too upsetting. Just discard the sordid parts. Consider us pure symbols. We're no more than real money.
Chapter 25. Heart of Flint. I descended the staircase, considering my choices. I pretend not to believe Euryclea when she told me that it was Odysseus who'd killed the suitors. Perhaps this man was an impostor. I'd said, how would I know what Odysseus looked like now? After 20 years, I was wondering how I must seem to him. I'd been very young when he sailed away. Now I was a matron. How could he fail to be disappointed? I decided to make him wait. I myself had waited long enough. Also, I would need time in order to fully disguise my true feelings about the unfortunate hanging of my 12 young maids. So when I entered the hall and saw him sitting there, I didn't say a thing. Telemachus wasted no time. Almost immediately, he was scolding me for not giving a warmer welcome to his father. Flintly-hearted, he called me scornfully. I could see he had a rosy little picture in his mind. The two of them siding against me, grown men together, two roosters in charge of the hen house. Of course, I wanted the best for him. He was my son. I hoped he would succeed as a political leader or a warrior or whatever he wanted to be. But at that moment, I wished there would be another Trojan war so I could send him off to it and get him out of my hair. Boys with their first beards can be a thorough pain in the neck. The hardness of my heart was a notion I was glad to foster. However, as it would reassure Odysseus to know I hadn't been throwing myself into the arms of every man who turned up claiming to be him. So I looked at him blankly and said it was too much for me to swallow. The idea that this dirty, blood-smeared vagabond was the same as my fine husband who had sailed away, so beautifully dressed 20 years before. Odysseus grinned. He was looking forward to the big revelation scene. This part where I would say, "It was you all along." What a terrific disguise, and throw my arms around his neck. Then he went off to take a much-needed bath. When he came back in clean clothes, smelling a good deal better than when he'd gone, I couldn't resist teasing him one last time. I ordered Euryclea to move the bed outside the bedroom of Odysseus and to make it up for the stranger. You'll recall the one post of this bed was carved from a tree still rooted in the ground. Nobody knew about it except Odysseus, myself, and my maid, Actorus, from Sparta, who by that time was long dead. Assuming that someone had cut through his cherished bedpost, Odysseus lost his temper at once. Only then did I relent and go through the business of recognizing him. I shed a satisfactory number of tears and embraced him and claimed that he'd passed the bedpost test and that I was now convinced. And so we climbed into the very same bed where we'd spent a great many happy hours when we were first married. Before Helen took it into her head to run off with Paris, lighting the fires of war and bringing desolation to my house, I was glad it was dark by then, as in the shadows we both appeared less wizened than we were. "We're not spring chickens any more," I said. "That which we are, said Odysseus. After a little time had passed and we were feeling pleased with each other, we took up our old habits of storytelling. Odysseus told me of all his travels and difficulties, the nobler versions with the monsters and the goddesses, rather than the more sordid ones with the innkeepers and whores. He recounted the many lies he'd invented, the false names he'd given himself, telling the Cyclops his name was No One. Was the cleverest of such tricks, though he'd spoiled it by boasting, and the fraudulent life his stories he'd concocted for himself, the better to conceal his identity and his intentions. In my turn, I related his tale of the Suitors, and my trick with the Shroud of Laertes, and my deceitful encouragings of the Suitors, and the skillful ways in which I misdirected them and led them on and played them off against one another. Then he told me how much he'd missed me, and how he'd been filled with longing for me even when enfolded in the white arms of goddesses. And I told him how very many tears I'd shed while waiting 20 years for his return, and how tedious faithful I'd been, and how I would never have even so much as thought of betraying his gigantic bed with its wondrous bedpost by sleeping in it with any other man. The two of us were, by our own admission, proficient and shameless liars of long standing. It was a wonder either one of us believed the word the other said, but we did, or so we told each other. No sooner had Odysseus returned than he left again. He said that much as he hated to tear himself away from me, he'd have to go adventuring again. He'd been told by the spirit of the seer Tiresias that he would have to purify himself by carrying an oar so far inland that the people there would mistake it for the winnowing fan. Only in that way could he rinse the blood of the suitors from him, avoid their vengeful ghosts and their vengeful relatives, and pacify the anger of the sea god Poseidon, who was still furious with him for blinding his son the Cyclops. It was a likely story, but then all his stories were likely.
Chapter 26. The chorus line. The trial of Odysseus as videotaped by the maids. Attorney for the defense. Your Honor, permit me to speak to the innocence of my client, Odysseus, a legendary hero of high repute, who stands before you accused of multiple murders. Was he or was he not justified in slaughtering, by means of arrows and spears? We do not dispute the slaughters themselves, or the weapons in question. Upwards of 120 well-born young men, give or take a dozen, who, I must emphasize, had been eating up his food without his permission, annoying his wife, and plotting to murder his son and usurp his throne. It has been alleged by my respected colleague that Odysseus was not so justified, since murdering these young men was a gross overreaction to the fact of their having played the gourmand a little too freely in his palace. Also, it is alleged that Odysseus and or his heirs and assigns had been offered material compensation for the missing comestibles, and ought to have accepted this compensation peacefully, but this compensation was offered by the very same young men who, despite many requests, had done nothing previously to curb their remarkable appetites, or to defend Odysseus, or to protect his family. They had to show no loyalty to him in his absence, on the contrary. So how dependable was their word? Could a reasonable man expect that they would ever pay a single ox of what they had promised? And let us consider the odds, 120, give or take a dozen, to 1, or stretching a point to 4, because Odysseus did have accomplices, as my colleague had termed them. That is, he had one barely grown relative and 2 servants untrained in warfare. What was to prevent these young men from pretending to enter into a settlement with Odysseus, then leaping upon him one dark night when his guard was down and doing him to death. It is our contention that, by seizing the only opportunity fate was likely to afford him, our generally esteemed client Odysseus was merely acting in self-defense. We therefore ask that you dismiss this case. Judge, I am inclined to agree. Attorney for the defense. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge, what's that commotion in the back? Order, ladies, stop making a spectacle of yourselves. Adjust your clothing, take those robes off your neck, sit down. The maids. You've forgotten about us. What about our case? You can't let him off. He hanged us in cold blood. 12 of us. 12 young girls for nothing. Judge, to attorney for the defense. This is a new charge. Strictly speaking, it ought to be dealt with in a separate trial. But as the two matters appear to be intimately connected, I prepare to hear arguments now. What do you have to say for your client? Attorney for the defense. He was acting within his rights, Your Honor. These were his slaves. Judge, nonetheless, he must have had some reason. Even slaves ought to not to be killed at whim. What had these girls done that they deserved hanging? Attorney for the defense. They'd had sex without permission. Judge, I see. With whom did they have sex? Attorney for the defense. With my client's enemies, Your Honors, the very ones who had designs on his wife, not to mention his life. Chuckles at his witticism. Judge, I take it these are the youngest maids. Attorney for the defense. Well, naturally. They were the best looking and the most bettable, certainly, for the most part. The maids laughed bitterly. Judge, leafing through the book. The Odyssey. It's written here in this book, a book we must needs consult, as it is the main authority on the subject. Although it had pronounced unethical tendencies and contains far too much sex and violence, in my opinion, it says right here, let me see, in book 22, that the maids were raped. The suitors raped them. Nobody stopped them from doing so. Also, the maids are described as having been hauled around by the suitors for their foul and or disgusting purposes. Your client knew all that. He is quoted as having said these things himself. Therefore, the maids were overpowered and they were also completely unprotected. Is that correct? Attorney for the defense. I wasn't there, Your Honor. All of this took place some 3,000 or 4,000 years before my time. Judge, I can see the problem. Call the witness, Penelope. Penelope, I was asleep, Your Honor. I was often asleep. I can only tell you what they said afterwards. Judge, who said? Penelope, the maids, Your Honor. Judge, they said they'd been raped. Penelope, well, yes, Your Honor, in effect. Judge, and did you believe them? Penelope, yes, Your Honor, that is, I tended to believe them. Judge, I understand that we're frequently impertinent. Penelope, yes, Your Honor, but, Judge, but you did not punish them, and they continued to work as your maids? Penelope, I knew them well, Your Honor. I was fond of them. I'd brought some of them up. You could say they were like daughters I never had. Starts to weep. I felt so sorry for them, but most maids got raped sooner or later. A deplorable and common feature of palace life. It wasn't the fact of their being raped that told against them. In the mind of Odysseus, it's that they were raped without permission. Judge chuckles. Excuse me, madam, but isn't that what rape is, without permission? Attorney for the defense. Without permission of their master, Your Honor. Judge, oh, I see, but their master wasn't present, so in effect, these maids were forced to sleep with the suitors because if they'd resisted, they would have been raped anyway, and much more unpleasantly. Attorney for the defense. I don't see what bearing that has on this case. Judge, neither did your client, evidently. Chuckles. However, your client's times were not on our times. Standards of behaviors were different then. It would be unfortunate if this regrettable but minor incident were allowed to stand as a blot on an otherwise exceedingly distinguished career. Also, I do not wish to be guilty of an anachronism. Therefore, I must dismiss the case. The maids. We demand justice. We demand retribution. We invoke the law of blood guilt. We call upon the angry ones. A troop of 12 Erinyes appear. They have hair made of serpents, the heads of dogs, and the wings of bats. They sniff the air. The maids, O angry ones, O furies, you are our last hope. We implore you to inflict punishment and exact vengeance on our behalf. Be our defenders, we who had none in this life. Smell out Odysseus wherever he goes, from one place to another, from one life to another. Whatever disguise he puts on, whatever shape he may take, hunt him down. Dog his footsteps on earth or in Hades, wherever he may take refuge, in songs and in plays, in tombs and in theses, in marginal notes and in appendices. Appear to him in our forms, our ruined forms, the forms of our pitiable corses. Let him never be at rest. The Erinyes turn towards Odysseus, their red eyes flash. Attorney for the defense, I call on gray-eyed Pallas Athene, immortal daughter of Zeus, to defend property rights and the right of a man to be the master in his own house, and to spirit my client away in a cloud. Judge, what's going on? Order, order. This is a 21st century court of justice. You there, get down from the ceiling. Stop that barking and hissing. Madam, cover up your chest and put down your spear. What's this cloud doing here? Where are the police? Where's the defendant? Where has everyone gone?
Chapter 27, Home Life in Hades. I was looking in on your world the other night, making use of the eyes of a channeler who'd gone into a trance. Her client wanted to contact her dead boyfriend about whether she should sell their condo, but they got me instead. When there's an opening, I frequently jump in to fill it. I don't get often as I'd like. Not that I mean to disparage my host as if it were, but still, it's amazing how the living keep on pestering the dead. From age to age, it hardly changes at all, though the methods vary. I can't say I miss the Sibyls much. Them and their golden bows hauling along all sorts of upstarts to trapeze around down here, wanting knowledge of the future and upsetting the shades. But at least the Sibyls had some manners. The magicians and conjurers who came later were worse, though they did take the whole thing seriously. Today's bunch, however, are most too trivial to merit any attention whatsoever. They want to hear about stock market prices and world politics and their own health problems and such stupidities, in addition to which they want to converse with the dead, a lot of dead non-entities we in this realm cannot be expected to know. Who is this Marilyn everyone is so keen on? Who is this Adolf? It's a waste of energy to spend time with these people, and so exasperating. But it was only by peering through such limited keyholes that I'm able to keep track of Odysseus, during those times as he's not down here in his own familiar form. I suppose you know the rules. If we wish to, we can get ourselves reborn and have another try at life. But first we have to drink from the waters of forgetfulness, so our past lives will be wiped from our memories. Such is the theory, but like all theories, it's only a theory. The waters of forgetfulness don't always work the way they're supposed to. Lots of people remember everything. Some say there is more than one kind of water, that the waters of memory are also on tap. I wouldn't know myself. Helen has more than a few excursions. That's what she calls them, my little excursions. I've been having such fun, she'll begin. Then she'll detail her latest conquest and fill me on the changes in fashion. It was through her that I learned about patches and sunshades and bustles and high-heeled shoes and girdles and bikinis and aerobic exercises and body piercings and liposuction. Then she'll make a speech about how naughty she's been and how much an uproar she's been causing and how many men she's ruined. Emperors have fallen because of her, she's fond of saying. I understand the interpretation of the whole Trojan War episode has changed, I tell her. To take some of the wind out of her sails. Now they think you were just a myth. It's always about trade routes. That's what the scholars are saying. Oh, Penelope, you can't still be jealous, she says. Surely we can be friends now. Why don't you come along with me to the upper world next time I go? We could do a trip to Las Vegas, girls' night out. But I forgot, that's not your style. You'd rather play the little faithful wifey, what with the weaving and so on. Bad me, I could never do it. I'd die of boredom. But you were always such a homebody. She's right. I'll never drink the waters of forgetfulness. I can't see the point of it. No, I can't see the point, but I don't want to take the risk. My past life was fraught with many difficulties, but who's to say the next one wouldn't be worse? Even with my limited access, I can see the world as just as dangerous as it was in my day, except that the misery and suffering are a much wider scale. As for human nature, it's as tardy as ever. None of this stops Odysseus. He'll drop down here for a little while. He'll act pleased to see me. He'll tell me life with me was the only thing he ever really wanted, no matter what ravishing beauties he's been falling into bed with, or what wild adventures he's been having. We'll take a peaceful stroll, snack on some osodil, and tell old stories. I'll hear his news of Telemachus. He's a member of parliament now. I'm so proud. And then, just when I'm starting to relax, when I'm feeling that I can forgive him for everything he put me through, and accept him with all of his faults, when I'm starting to believe that this time he really means it, he goes off again. making a beeline for the rivulet to be born again. He does mean it. He really does. He wants to be with me. He weeps when he says it, but then some force tears us apart. It's the maids. He sees them in the distance heading our way. They make him nervous. They make him restless. They cause him pain. They make him want to be anywhere and anyone else. He's been a French general. He's been a Mongolian invader. He's been a tycoon in America. He's been a headhunter in Borneo. He's been a film star, an inventor, an advertising man. It's always ended badly, with a suicide or accident or death in battle, or an assassination, and then he's back here again. Why can't you leave him alone? I yell at the maids. I have to yell because they won't let me get near them. Surely it's enough. He did penance. He said the prayers. He got himself purified. It was not enough for us, they call. What more do you want from him? I ask him. But this time I'm crying. Just tell me. But they only run away. Run isn't quite accurate. Their legs don't move. Their still twitching feet don't touch the ground.
Chapter 28, the chorus line. We're walking behind you, a love song. Yoo-hoo, Mr. Nobody, Mr. Nameless, Mr. Master of Illusions, Mr. Sleight of Hand, grandson of thieves and bards. We're here too, the ones without names, the other ones without names, the ones with the shame stuck onto us by others, the ones pointed at, the ones fingered. The chore girls, the bright-cheeked girls, the juicy gigglers, the cheeky young wigglers, the young blood scrubbers, 12 of us, 12 moon-shaped bums, 12 yummy mouths, 24 feather pillow tits, and best of all, 24 twitching feet. Remember us? Of course you do. We brought the water for you to wash your hands. We bathed your feet. We rinsed your laundry. We oiled your shoulders. We laughed at your jokes. We ground your corn. We turned down your cozy bed. You roped us in. You strung us up. You left us dangling like clothes on a line. What hijinks, what kicks, how virtuous you felt, how righteous, how purified. Now that you'd got rid of the plump, young, dirty girls inside your head, you should have buried us properly. You should have poured wine over us. You should have prayed on our forgiveness. Now you can't get rid of us wherever you go, in your life or your afterlife or any of your other lives. We can see through all your disguises, the paths of day, the paths of darkness, whichever paths you take. We're right behind you, following you like a trail of smoke, like a long tail, a tail made of girls, heavy as memory, light as air. 12 accusations, toes skimming the ground, hands tied behind our backs, tongue sticking out, eyes bulging, songs choked in our throats. Why did you murder us? What had we done to you that required our deaths? You never answered that. It was an act of grudging, it was an act of spite, it was an honor killing. You who, Mr. Thoughtfulness, Mr. Goodness, Mr. Godlike, Mr. Judge, look over your shoulder. Here we are, walking behind you. Close by, close as a kiss, close as your own skin. We're the serving girls. We're here to serve you. We're here to serve you right. We'll never leave you. We'll stick to you like your shadow, soft and relentless as glue. Pretty maids all in a row.
Chapter 29, Envoy. We had no voice. We had no name. We had no choice. We had one face the same. We took the blame. It was not fair. Now we're here all too, the same as you. Now we follow you. We find you now. We call to you, to wit, to woo, to wit, to woo, to woo. The maids sprout feather and fly away as owls.